Haruron. Oh fuck. Haruron. I mean, that is hello. Oh. Rebel levels.
Joe Foley, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank
Joe Foley, welcome back to the show.
Oh, thank you very much. Good to be here.
You're an atheist?
Yes,
I'm an atheist.
allegedly.
We have asked our respective followers for questions that atheists cannot answer. And today, well, we're going to try and answer them.
Well, I notice it's a good follow-up. I feel like we meet up every couple of months and attempt to destroy our own worldviews. So this is a good follow-on from those conversations.
That's right. We should make a regular thing of it. If you follow me on Twitter, or I suppose the YouTube community post, and I think you posted on YouTube as well.
Yeah.
We ask for questions, and these could be from atheists, it could be from theists. The idea is questions that traditionally I thought of as questions that atheists in particular struggle to answer. Beginning with what is perhaps the most foundational question, not just of the philosophy of religion, but of all. Why is there something rather than nothing?
Yes, I mean it's you go big or go home for the first question. I think this is a very interesting one, in the sense that it almost sneaks in a really cool presupposition that I think that I've seen some atheists disagree. It's like, why is there something rather than nothing? Is asking if there is a reason why there is something rather than nothing, and it assumes that that's a question with a sensible answer. And I have heard some atheists say, essentially, do the response of, well, what do you mean by that? You know, what do you mean by why? And you know, I think that sometimes can be sort of a facetious response. But something that, for instance, like David Hume addresses, which I think is an interesting aspect, at the very least worth considering, is that he suggests that questions like why is there something rather than nothing, the domain in which they're operating is fundamentally unlike the domain through which we've acquired most of our knowledge gathering apparatus. So, you know, Hume's an empiricist, and he talks about how, well, we're gathering our ideas from the material world around us. Or let's not be that controversial, just the world around us. And additionally, he thinks that we learn reason, even if he's not, you know, not entirely sure what the kind of metaphysical grounding of reason is. He thinks that our reasoning faculties are attuned to this reality that we live in. And so something that he brings up, which I think is very interesting, is the notion that questions like why is there something rather than nothing are, in principle, unanswerable. Is his idea, at least. And it's not that he thinks necessarily just that they are unverifiable. Like, why is there something rather than nothing? Oh, maybe there's a god, maybe there's like a platonic ordering to the world that dwells in a realm of forms. It's not so much. That's not so much his issue. That becomes an issue for a lot of like 20th century philosophers. But Hume, through his kind of skeptical method, basically raises the idea that it's just unanswerable because the tools that we've got to form beliefs and form opinions and reason aren't suited to the domain in which that question needs to be answered. Which is sort of a cop-out answer, I suppose.
Well, does it mean that the questioner is right, that this is a question that atheists can't answer?
Hume would say it's a question that no one can answer.
Yeah.
Which I think may end up potentially becoming a bit of a theme. Well, because you know, and the other presupposition of the why is there something rather than nothing is that it has this kind of like teleological bent to it, which I find really interesting, because I think that one of the presuppositional differences in almost temperament between a lot of atheists and a lot of theists is that I think that a lot of people, I think that a lot of theistic answers appeal to this like teleological instinct we have in order to find not just mechanistic explanations and not just kind of causal explanatory theories, but reasonable ones. So if I were to drop this like energy drink can, then this new tonic.
Wave it for the camera.
Yeah.
We're not sponsored, but maybe one day.
But if I were to drop it, then there'd be two ways of approaching that. One is explaining that. One is to say, well, the force of gravity acted on the can, and all of the muscles in my hand unclenched, and there was an electrical signal that went from my brain to the hand, and that would be a kind of a mechanistic explanation. I can't say the word explanation quite right.
This is incredibly short.
But that would be a mechanistic explanation, and whereas a teleological one in terms of reasons or purposes, one might say, kind of broadly construed, would be that I wanted to and then I did. And those two types of explanatory hypothesis often run parallel in everyday life, especially when explaining human behavior. And I think the why is there something rather than nothing. You know, one of the reasons I think that the kind of, oh, well, there was the Big Bang, or like stuff like that, or well, because, you know, we have this causal story that runs towards this whatever point in time the universe began at, etc., etc., etc. Why I think that a lot of the time that seems unsatisfactory, especially to someone with a sort of with this kind of teleological predisposition, is that it doesn't have this parallel sort of, well, what's the reason why it is the case? You know, there's an underlying methodological assumption, I think, to basically all inquiry, which is good because otherwise I don't think inquiry would be possible. That we're going to have intelligible answers to whatever questions we ask. And I think that, you know, why is there something rather than nothing is a perfectly sensible question. And I think that it tugs on this teleological instinct that we have. But
physically hard.
Something that I think that Hume raises as a possibility is just that our mechanisms of knowledge and sense acquisition simply aren't equipped to answer questions like this. So I think, to be honest, I think it's a bit of a cop-out.
It has to be a cop-out. I mean, this question is a sensible question, like you say.
Yes,
Why is there something rather than nothing? Everybody likes to ask that. Everybody likes to address that question. In a lot of philosophy and theology, I think, there's that sort of
I think that's a dumb
bell
question.
curve of intelligent questioning, which like begins with, well, why is there something rather than nothing? It's like the most naive, simple, unintelligent question you can ask, which is super straightforward.
I asked myself this question when I was like, I don't know, 6 years old or something. And when I was older, that would blow my mind. But the answer is basically because were there to be nothing, there would be no one and nothing to experience. So, if there ever was nothing, you would never be able to witness it. So it's only possible to witness something.
And then as the intelligence of the question raises, it's like, why is there a contingent series of cause and effect? But then you get down to the really, again, super smart, super intelligent, very meaningful question, and you right back round to, why is there something rather than nothing? It's fundamental for a reason. I think that if you really reflect on the possibility of a world in which there's nothing, I mean, like a possible world, a way that things could have been, that's just empty. And there seems to be an empty possible world, and we do not occupy that possible world. And why? It seems like nothing is the neutral position, and that there being something is this sort of strange like insertion into that space. So I have spoken to atheists who basically ask questions like, well, is it possible for there to be nothing? I mean, is it not a contradiction to say there is nothing? If nothing is nothing, you can't say there is nothing, and so it's impossible to have nothing. And if it's impossible to have nothing, then there must be something. This is basically a way, I think, of putting forward what I think is the atheist's best bet in answering this question, hypothesizing that essentially the universe is necessary. When you speak to a theist and they say, well, things exist because God brought them into existence, and then you naively ask, well, then what brought God into existence? They say, well, God doesn't get brought into existence. God is a special kind of like first cause, which by virtue of being the first cause, the foundational cause, is itself not cause. That's fine. That's not an illegal chess move. You can do that. But I think a lot of atheists turn around and say, well, like, maybe the Big Bang, maybe the beginning of the universe is super special, which does seem a little bit like, yeah, okay, that's easy enough to say. But if you think about the fact that at the Big Bang, for example, the laws of physics just like break down. They just sort of stop working, right? And it does seem like a very special kind of event in that way, which makes it sort of not seem impossible to me that there's some kind of weird way in which that can be like separated from things that happen within the universe that finally arises, such that like, yeah, maybe the universe sort of necessarily came into existence, maybe it necessarily exists. I don't believe that that's true, but I think that's basically the best option available for the atheists on this question.
I think that raises a really interesting point about this idea of like necessity, right? There's I don't want to, there are theological reasons why one might argue that God is necessary, and I think there are decent philosophical reasons to argue why something might be necessary rather than nothing. In the sense that even in set theory, if you want to say nothing, you say the set of things, the empty set, the set of things that contain nothing. It's
still describing a thing.
Yes, yeah.
Because true nothingness, I think Aristotle defined as what rocks dream of.
Oh, that's very poetic.
It's not just like nothing, It's not like you speak to Lawrence Krauss, and he says that nothing isn't really nothing, and it's something. And you think, okay, that's fine. That's right. And that is actually really interesting, and there's some great science there, but we're not talking about the same thing. When someone says, "Oh, there's not nothing," there's quantum fluctuations. Well then there never was nothing. I mean, if somebody says something like, if you take the Kraussian line and say, "Well, nothing doesn't exist," nothing isn't really nothing. I think that's just a version of saying that there can't be nothing. Yeah. That stuff just necessarily exists, because even when you have nothing, there's still something there. That's just a way of saying that there isn't really nothing at all. And so that there isn't really nothing at all.
Yeah.
And so, if you've got your sort of philosophy cap on,
That's
anytime you hear this sort of scientific attempt to redefine nothing to be something, I think we have to recognise that what's really going on there is another kind of stuff exists necessarily kind of argument.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of difficult. You can really tie yourself in knots defining nothing. Because I remember posing this to a classroom of logic students, and being and asking, how would you define nothing? And they said, well, the set in which every proposition, or the universe in which every proposition is false. And I was like, well, what about there does not exist an X? Or an X such that F, where F is whatever predicate you like. I was like, well, that would be true. I was like, oh god, yes, there's a true proposition in the nothingness. Yes. I thought, it's kind of a fun little formal exercise.
Someone in the comment once said to me on YouTube, true nothingness would not contain the constraining axiom that something can't come from nothing. So why not? Why can't something come from nothing? If it's truly nothing, then where's the rule that says that something can't come from nothing?
The other thing, I mean, I really like that, because I feel like that's gonna come up a lot later, where it's where are rules something? And
What are the laws of logic?
Yes, yeah. But the talking about possibilities, about whether there could be something rather than nothing, I think is very interesting, because it again, going back to this methodological point that doesn't quite spell out, but I actually think with kind of modern ideas about possible worlds, we can think in a bit more detail about. Reasoning about possible worlds is kind of weird in and of itself, and I think that it's one of those things that aren't, if you wanted to, you could argue that all of our reasoning about possibility, again, is grounded in this world, right? I can there's a camera over there, and I can imagine a world in which there is no camera, and I know that's possible because of all of my experience of worlds of rooms that don't have cameras in. There is an argument to be made that is really disanalogous to the situation of, well, could there have been nothing rather than something? It's true that there could have been nothing rather than something, in the sense that it doesn't seem to imply a contradiction. Well, unless you ask some ancient Greek philosophers, but let's just assume that it doesn't imply a contradiction. Then there is the further point of, well, just because something doesn't imply a contradiction, that may mean that it's logically possible under the rules of classical logic, as in you can form a model of it. But does that mean it's metaphysically possible? The universe could not have existed. What would it take to make that phrase true? How do we even go about investigating the possibilities there? Because normally, as I say, we're using our imagination. Can you conceive of a world that's different from ours, at the very least, right? Because let's not, if we're going to abstract from why is there something rather than nothing, to why is there, why does our universe hold the particular characteristics that it does? You can imagine a universe where, okay, it's not nothing, but it's just empty space, and that seems like it holds the same kind of question for the atheist.
It depends what you mean by empty space, right? Because when you say the possible world which contains nothing, and by the way, when we talk about possible worlds here, this is a way of conceptualizing probability, right? It's it's a way that the world could have been, by the world I mean everything which is. I don't mean the Earth. I mean everything which is. And so a possible world is a conceptual tool to think about what was possible. So there is the way that people use the language. There is a possible world in which your shirt is blue instead of pink. That's how people talk about it.
Yes,
It's not like,
yeah.
oh, there could be, like, the language that's used is, there is this possible world where
Yeah,
everything is
yeah.
the same, except, like, your shirt is blue. And, okay, so there's a possible world in which there's nothing. But then, even just, like, imagining that, I'm kind of imagining this, like, big orb that exists somewhere that's just empty and black. Like, the world itself still seems to kind of, like, exist in order to contain nothing. I mean, if it truly was nothing, like,
This one
what is
hard
that
to
sort of
remember.
possible world contained in? Like even like conceptually, if there's no abstract objects, if there are no numbers, if there's like, I mean, do numbers exist in this possible world?
Yeah, I suppose the closest you come to is be like there's a model such that it only contains the empty set.
Yeah, but you're still talking about a model, right?
Well, yes, exactly. Yes.
And so that's why I think that the best shot the atheist has here is to use this kind of language to say sort of, when you really start imagining the possibility of there being nothing, like, it's sort of not possible to do.
Do you not think we still have a problem in that as in whatever, sure, there may necessarily exist something, but we have a lot more than just something. We have a lot more than just there is a thing that is true. And I think and my response to that particular worry is to throw some gentle skepticism on the idea that our possible world's
supposed to
reasoning
jump there.
stretches to the possible existence or non-existence of our universe as a whole. Partly because I don't really know how
Forgot.
I don't really know how my imagination is justified to hook onto the different possibilities.
Yeah, this is hard.
I know, but I'm open
mentally.
to being convinced, because also we're in really dangerous territory with that sort of response, because possible world reasoning is so useful for the rest
So
of
much
the world.
else.
So there is, again, I think there's a genuine, like, non-trivial problem for an atheist answer to this question if they want to go down the route of, well, how reliable is our possible world's reasoning at the level of the whole universe, where we have to cut the distinction fine enough that we get around this question, or in other ways, express the intuition that I think that a lot of atheists
never
have, that
saw
this
that
question is
art.
in some way dodgy, without getting rid of possible world's reasoning in much of the rest of the reasoning, because that is it's such a useful tool. Like, it's in everything from probability to epistemic logic to just like planning. Like, can you imagine planning without thinking about possibilities?
Yeah.
So it's a high stakes game. This why is there something rather than nothing question.
How much sleep do you lose over this particular question? Because I must admit, for myself, it's one of those super naive sounding philosophical questions that I think is really worth, like, reminding oneself of just how serious a challenge it is, and how incredible it is to think about stuff. Like, sometimes I'm just like looking at an object. It could be like the wood on this chair or something, and it's just like there's just like stuff that exists, and it seems like that stuff could not have existed. And it's such a simple, naive thought, but it's really like it's incredible.
Oh, it
And
was
so
actually
I
hard.
think about it a lot now.
I have no idea
does it
how I
trouble you?
beat
Yeah,
it.
I mean, I go back and forth on it, right? Because I think it's a very natural question to go back and forth on how philosophically troubling it is.
Yeah.
But partly because, like, stuff is like water to a fish. It is
Oh.
like, what would it mean to not have stuff? But you're right. It is remarkable if we are considering the open possibility that there could have
I
not
did
been
this
stuff,
one right.
or at the very least that this stuff could have been like totally different. Like, the world, the idea that the world could have contained contradictions. That's really interesting, and that's some like Graham Priest is a logician who has set up this remarkable system of paraconsistent and paracomplete logics, which are logics where basically you get rid of the law of non-contradiction, or you get rid of various other laws of, like, completeness and stuff. And then he'd say, well, in some possible worlds there'll be, or in some impossible worlds, which is another fascinating term that comes up in these paraconsistent logics. Yeah, the world is sometimes is contradictory, and I think, okay, yeah, that's fine, and that's outside the realms of what we would standardly consider logically possible. But could it have existed? And this is where my intuitions run out, and I go, well, actually, I don't think I have a firm grasp on the ways in which I think the universe could be. Like, think about if we're thinking about possible worlds alongside this kind of probability vein, so they're not exactly the same, but like they're clearly related. If I'm like rolling a die, I can, or six-sided die, I can be like, right, there are going to be six relevant possible worlds open. And I know that because of all of the other times I've observed dice. But we haven't observed universe formation or universe being, and so I kind of when I attempt to justify why I think there could have been something rather than nothing, or why I think the universe could have been different on this kind of not just intra-universe
No,
objects could
I
have been
didn't
different, but the
actually.
universe fundamentally could have been different. I struggle to like I have this strong intuition that it could have been, and then I really struggle to justify it to myself.
Yeah.
It
can
does
actually
keep me up
just
at
I mean,
night.
thinking
go
about
there.
probability, like I often think
No, I
about
don't
like
want to.
if I roll a 5 on a die, to think about like what the probability of that was, I kind of think, well, if I ran that back and did it again,
Did I click one
how
of
many times would it
these?
have come out as a 5? And if I say, well, every time I ran it, it came out a 5, then it's like it had to happen. You know, that's a way of sort of thinking
Yes,
about
yeah,
probability.
yeah.
When I think about the universe existing, so okay, well, let's run it back, and how many times when we run it back does the universe? Well, run what back?
Yeah, exactly. I think
From where?
Yeah,
From
where are we gonna
from
replay it?
what? You know, like where does it start? I mean, especially if time itself is like a physical property of the universe. This question of like, you know, running it again and seeing if it works is like, I mean, Hume in other contexts talks about the fact that we don't have other universes to compare.
Yes. Yeah.
We just don't have any kind of like control group or point of comparison. We have just no idea, and so like it's difficult for me to even conceive of what it would mean to imagine there being nothing, and yet at the same time, like you say, it's so obvious, it's so simple. It's like, of course there could have been nothing.
Yes,
you know?
well, I think part of this is that there is vagueness in the concept of could, like just impossibility in general. Because and and often this is solved by a modifier. So you can say, okay, logically possible, metaphysically possible, or physically possible. And I think I have a broad idea of what's physically possible, and I have a much clearer idea of what's logically possible, because that's much neater and kind of you have fewer rules to worry about. But metaphysically possible is a real grey area. I don't know what's metaphysically possible, and I'm not sure
You
that I
just
could.
spam.
And then there are philosophers that
But this one
try
will
to
do
know,
later.
and best of luck to them.
Gonna.
But certainly I really struggle to justify my sense of what's metaphysically possible. So why is something rather than nothing? I will admit, I have no answer. But I also would tentatively suggest that no one in principle has an answer. Like as in if you want to take the theist idea of well, there's something rather than nothing because God created it. I mean, there's a kind of, again, to your bell curve thing, the kind of silly atheist response, which is, well, why is God necessary? And then the kind of middle, the big hump, which is the sort of engaging with all of the kind of theological literature around divine necessity, which I think is very interesting in its own right. And then getting to the other side and being like, yeah, but like, why is God necessary? Because it doesn't seem like it's contradictory to say that there is no God. And if that's the benchmark, because that's the benchmark we used for discussing whether the universe could or could not have existed, then it seems like we are at the same problem.
And the sort of ontologically minded theist might want to say, well, God not existing is a contradiction because of the meaning of the word God. I mean, God is the maximally great being, maximal qualities, or God is the greatest conceivable being, and that means you must conceive of him existing, or whatever. And my regular listeners or viewers will know that I give a lot of credit to the ontological argument, more than most people do. I think it's brilliant. I think it's great fun. But in the same way that, like, okay, well done, clever clogs, like you've sort of got this concept of God which is kind of difficult to imagine not existing, even like conceivably. I would say that there's a similar sort of thought you can have about nothing.
Yeah,
as a materialist, right?
Can you imagine nothing?
Whether you're a materialist or not, it's sort of like, well, okay, if something is possible, then you should be able to conceive of it happening. So now conceive of there being nothing. Oh, look, you can't do it because as soon as you're conceiving of anything, it's not nothing. Therefore, nothing is not possible. Therefore, to your question, why is there something rather than nothing? It's like, that's like asking, why is God necessary? It's just like, it just has to be that way by the definition of something, like by the definition of even conceiving of possibility. Now, I don't think that would work. I think because somebody's gonna listen to that and they're gonna be like, yeah, but like, man, there could have been nothing. They just could, right? And some people will want to say to the God question, I know you've got this clever ontological argument that sort of defines him as necessary, but like, he could not exist.
Alright, almost
Well,
done.
I think there is real vagueness around what we're meaning by could.
I should
Not to
turn
be
this
all
off.
not to be all the kind of stereotypical philosopher. Like, what do you mean by that? But what do you mean by could? Genuinely, there is ambiguity in the scope of could. Because I say, classically it seems like could is the possibilities that are left when you have imposed certain constraints on a set of models. So I say classical logic imposes certain constraints on models, and physical laws would impose certain constraints on models if you want to be compatible with physical laws. But then, I say, this in-between realm where it's like, well, you know, the laws of physics could have been different. And it's like, well, could have been within what constraints? Because logic. I think the trouble is that physical possibility isn't sufficient to show this could have been nothing rather than something proposition, because physically, within physical laws, it doesn't seem like that's the case. But logical possibility is almost seems like it is not connected enough with the universe to be all that, like, if you like, because if we say logical possibility according to classical logic is just things like non-contradiction, and if we say it is not contradictory that there would be nothing rather than something, that doesn't seem to have the same pull as when someone says there could have been nothing rather than something. So it strikes me that then we must need something slightly stronger than that, at least on a first glance. I might be wrong, but so it seems like we are grasping for some sense of could, some sense of possibility that is that does more than logical possibility, but far less than physical possibility. I don't know. Again, so this is again. I think that it would be fair to say that this is almost a cop-out answer, because it is saying I'm in disagreement with the question. Or at least I think the question requires further clarification. But I do think it's very interesting, and you know, arguably it is a genuine question that atheists can't answer.
Yeah, I mean, atheists can try to answer it, like with some universal necessity thing, might not be satisfactory, but likewise, you know, theists try to answer it, and it's up to you to decide whether you think that's satisfactory. I mean, they always have an answer to this question, but the question is whether that satisfies you enough, and for many it does. I mean, even if you are a theist, it's still like pretty amazing that like the universe exists. There's still something to sort of pause and think about and wonder about the possibility of there having been nothing. I mean, I guess for the theist, there's never nothing in the sense that there's always just something of God. Like the nothing they're imagining everything coming out of is like physical nothing. You know, there's no material things, and yeah, I mean, maybe that's their way out of say, well, yeah, no, you can't conceive of nothing, but you can conceive there being no material stuff, and it's out of that the universe sort of is brought into being by this non-material entity.
A very interesting thing that I think is also touched upon is the fact that we are so much happier, just intuitively, and I'm not suggesting this is wrong, it's just kind of an observation. We are much happier to accept a metaphysical grounding that ends in the immaterial than that ends in the material. As in, you know, and I think this might be because we can conceive of material things not existing in a much more straightforward way. But yeah, this idea of, okay, well, what's the beginning of material stuff? You end up with the immaterial plane, be that kind of platonic or theistic or whatever, what have you. And then even I think that the question then, oh well, why was there immaterial something rather than nothing? For some reason, and I don't know if this is just naive intuitions, like I'm less troubled by that question. It seems so much easier to smuggle in necessary existence in the immaterial than the material.
Yeah.
And again, but there is the possibility that this is just because we don't have direct access to the immaterial. In quite the same way that we do to the material, it is much easier to imagine the necessary existence there, whereas we can disprove necessary existence for intramaterial world objects because we've seen things come in and out of existence.
Yeah, I think I know what you mean. We've spoken about this before, I think, this sort of explanations terminating in immaterial and material things. We were talking about free will, and it's sort of like, well, why does the brain do this? Why does the hand move? Why does the neuron fire? Whatever. And you keep wanting to ask, well, why did that happen? And what determined that? What determined that? And if you get back to a point where someone says, oh, it was because of the soul, it was the immaterial self that did it, people just go like, okay.
Yes, exactly.
And it's like, okay, we just end there.
Yeah, and that is prima facie really weird that we do find that satisfying. And there is the question of asking whether we are justified in being satisfied.
It's almost as if we imagine these non-material things as not having like mechanisms which can be asked about in that way.
Yes,
you know.
One thing is that I think that there is potentially I think a kind of a tendency towards being satisfied with agential explanations at the end point, because like in everyday life we often are, right? If again, take the thing of me dropping the Newtonic, me saying, oh, I wanted to drop it and so I did, tells you basically everything you need to know. But it is weird. On the train ride here, there was a really cool example of this, where there was this like 5-year-old sitting across from me on the train, and she was trying to colour in her unicorn colouring book, and one of the pens had ran out of ink. And she said, she put this in the most fascinating way. She turned to her dad and said, "Daddy, the pen has lied to me." And I was like, that's amazing. That's That's agential bias in explanation, just like in front of me.
That was incredible. Yeah, well, because they say that of children, that children sort of have like agential preferences in explanation. If you ask children why do rocks exist, and you give them the option, you know, does it exist because of some insert physical explanation, or do rocks exist so that the bears can scratch their backs? You know, kids always prefer the bears scratching their back explanation. So atheists have used this observation as a sort of atheist argument to say that, you know, we have this like natural sense to this natural want to improperly attribute agency where it doesn't belong, because obviously the real explanation for the rock being there is because of the physical explanation. But oh, look at the silly children saying that it's because the bear wants to scratch its back. That's what religious people are like when they're like, why does the world exist? Oh, so that the big man in the sky can have as good people. But the thing is, like, you can also use the same consideration in the other direction to say that, well, why would humans have this like this tendency to believe in agential explanations if they weren't, you know, like somehow more appropriate or more proper? And in fact, the theists will even say that the analogy is wrong, because why does the rock exist? Is it so the bear can scratch his back? Well, no. But is it because like of the atoms bumping into each other, blah blah blah? Well, kind of, but also no, because for them ultimately it was an agential explanation. It's just another kind of agential explanation. It was God, you know.
Yeah, it's also I think that we have to be reasonably careful. Similar to what I was saying about the possible worlds thing, we have to be pretty careful about how much we undermine our own demands for explanatory hypotheses and our own reasoning faculties. Because another problem that people raise for well, not so much atheism, but for a monist materialist understanding of reality is the idea that we'll end up undermining our own reasoning faculties. We can't believe in truth.
Yeah,
and that is, you know, that's a genuine philosophical worry, right?
Which we'll talk about.
We'll get to.
We're going to get there. Perhaps we should move on, because otherwise we'll be here.
How long are we nattering about?
God knows.
Something wrong.
How long? 30 minutes. 30 minutes,
How many
ladies and
questions do we
gentlemen. Too many to count, so we'll try and speed things up just a little bit. Okay, question number 2. What do you do if you're not getting enough fruit and vegetables? I can take this one actually. That is where today's sponsor, AG1, can help you. AG1 is a daily, convenient nutritional supplement. It's a blend of over 70 vitamins, minerals, and other ingredients, including gut-friendly bacteria, antioxidants, high-quality mushrooms, and more. Just one scoop of AG1 once a day contains the nutrients you need to help support your mental performance, your energy levels, your heart health, and your immune system. And as the science advances, so does AG1. AG1 was born 14 years ago, and since then there have been 52 iterations. That's 52 improvements over 14 years to bring you the best possible nutritional supplement. And AG1 can aid healthy aging. Do you not have as much energy as you had maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago? Me neither. AG1 can help you with that. So if you're starting to notice differences in your skin, your hair, your nails, then AG1 is something you should consider. And trying AG1 is risk-free. If you're not 100% satisfied within 30 days, they'll give you your money back. So if you want to replace your multivitamin and more, start with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first subscription. Go to drinkag1.com/withinreason. That's drinkag1.com/withinreason to check it out. With that said, back to Joe. Okay, the real question 2. Any question that starts with a why
is a question that atheists can't answer.
Yeah, that is the word why, not the letter Y.
Yes, yeah. That's fantastic. And again, I actually think that this ties in quite nicely to the intuition we were talking about before, about we do have this kind of crying out for teleology in our why questions, because there are two. Like, why is wonderfully ambiguous as a question in everyday life. When we ask why, we often we mean it in two ways. What caused this to be the case, and what is the reason this is the case? Or, you know, it's interesting. Richard Broughty, kind of offhandedly almost, defined this distinction between reasonable and causal explanatory hypotheses, and I think this really touches upon it, right? Certainly in materialist atheism, and there is non-materialist atheism, which is, again, its own fascinating topic. But I think it's fair to say that most atheists are coming at it from a materialist standpoint. Yeah, you eliminate teleology. You don't have, arguably, you don't have purposes or reasons in this sense of why is this? Yeah, it basically in the sense of purpose, right? In this teleological factor. At which point, yeah, you actually do lose questions of why. But it is worth noting that that's not actually an implication of atheism.
It's materialism.
It's an implication
I
of
was just about
materialism.
to say that it's not a problem for atheism because the real problem is when you reduce everything to the material, which I suppose almost all materialists are going to be atheists, but it doesn't mean that all atheists are going to be materialists. You could be an atheist who believes that consciousness is immaterial or something, but you still don't believe in God. Like the problem I've always had with the example you gave earlier of there sort of being these two competing styles of explanation, it's something I hear commonly in religious discourse, like why did I boil, like why did the kettle boil? Well, one answer is because the atoms got excited and the temperature increased and then the water turned into steam. Fine. Another explanation is because I was thirsty and wanted a cup of tea.
Yeah.
And so they say, so there's like an agential answer and there's a material physical answer, and so where we have scientific explanations for how the world works, that doesn't rule out God, because God is like the agential answer. The problem for me when I hear that is I'm like, well, just analyze for a second what the like I wanted a cup of tea and was thirsty is. Like for the materialist, that explanation, like, well, I was thirsty and I wanted a cup of tea, is just a material like event in the brain, and so it is actually just part of the original chain. So why did the kettle boil? Because the atoms got excited, because the electric circuit was completed, because the flick was switched, because the electro signals in my arm moved the finger, because the brain did this, because I was thirsty, and the thirstiness is like a material thing in my brain, and so it just sort of becomes part of one long chain, and so you've sort of broken down this ability to say that there are two different kinds of explanations.
Oh yeah, I mean certainly that's an implication of the materialist worldview. I think that this question is presumably getting at the idea that their first premise is that
I don't think
teleological questions are sensible to ask, and then saying, well, if you have a materialist worldview, then, as you say, all of the teleological explanations collapse into causal ones.
Well, the question might actually think that teleological answers aren't sensible to ask and just sort of accept that.
Yes,
like
well, that again, it's similar to. I think that a lot of atheist responses to these questions that atheists can't answer are, genuinely to put forward a positive argument for dissolving the question. But there is a debate about what you lose if you lose teleology, and much of I think the questions that atheists purportedly cannot answer are to do with this dissolution of teleology, because teleology can give you all sorts of things. It can give you morality, and it can give you meaning, and all sorts. Right? Purpose is such a weighty concept. I think that to use this question as an opportunity, though, to expand or to like broaden our kind of metaphysical imaginations,
I don't remember,
so to speak, is that obviously online, like there is often this dichotomy drawn between atheism as materialism and theism as non-materialism. And that makes sense, right? Because I think materialism is a very popular atheist position. But it is not the only one.
This one.
If you're going to explore the different possibilities there, you can also have things like a Platonist atheistic worldview. So if Plato did believe in gods, or at least he gives an indication of believing in gods in his dialogues. But at the same time, much of the explanatory work in his metaphysics is done by the forms, which aren't agential. They are immaterial and they're metaphysically grounding, but they're not agential. And that's one atheistic possibility. And it's a possibility that some atheist philosophers of mathematics use when they're trying to explain, why does maths work? This is really weird. And they say, well, if you want to metaphysically ground maths, we could always turn to Plato. And there's also this. There was also it was kind of an ancient view, and it's kind of cracked back in a little bit, because Thomas Nagel is like seemingly a fan of this, where you just have a very thick conception of nature. So the kind of inherited, kind of post-enlightenment view of nature is that it consists entirely of ises.
It's for gene-modified, genetically modified people.
And then you have the is-ought gap. And in some ancient philosophies, this is-ought separation doesn't make any sense, because they have a much thicker conception of what nature amounts to. Some Stoic philosophers are outright theists, but some, at least in their writings, don't reference God, or don't reference God that heavily, but they will reference this thick conception of nature, whereby nature is in some way both descriptive and normative. And so that's another view that doesn't imply atheism. Doesn't imply theism, and so is in some ways compatible with atheism, but would also give you teleology. The trouble with this, though, I think, is that it tends to conflict with the methodological principles that have drawn many people to atheism, which I think, again, it's not like I've done like a survey or anything, so I can't speak to this, but when I speak to a lot of atheists, including myself, when I'm pacing around my room, speaking to myself like a madman, is that it tends to be something like you begin from like an empiricist standpoint, and then you kind of build outwards from there, and you go, well, what do I see? I can see the natural world. I see, at least in my estimation, the natural world doesn't imply a creator. There's not a kind of conditional there, and as a result, a creator isn't in my theory of reality. It's not a statement implied by the things I believe, and I don't have independent reason to believe it. And so it tends to fall out of that kind of thing. And materialism also tends to fall out of that. And unless you encounter a worry that you're or something that you're very, very stressed about, and you're like, okay, I just can't do without this, and then there are reasons to reintroduce teleology. People tend to want to stick with this material standpoint because also it's lovely to have like that structure where you begin with an epistemological principle, it spits out a metaphysical principle for you, and you can make that work consistently. Is just so wonderfully satisfying. From a kind of, it really tickles the kind of philosophical structure itch, I think, in people's brains, or certainly in my brain. So, and to a certain extent, saying, oh well, we can't answer this question, so we're going to introduce teleology at the metaphysical level. It just seems a bit like, oh, you ruined that like lovely neat flow structure that took you from epistemology down to your beliefs about God and stuff. So I think there is a worry there that there's a certain amount of ad hociness going on. If then we start saying, oh well, actually no, we've got this thick conception of nature. On the other hand, there is certain philosophers, I think Thomas Hogarth has argued, where he says, well, actually no, our intuitions about purpose are empirical data that imply that there is teleology out there, and I don't think I agree. But I'm just wanted to raise it to say it's not entirely inconsistent with empiricism to try and have a thicker conception of nature.
This is insane.
Okay, you mentioned it. Let's do it.
Yeah.
Atheists cannot get an ought from an ought. Well, to a certain extent, there's a strong argument that no one can get an ought from an ought. This is a fairly common theme in this genre of response video, I find, when somebody says, why does the universe exist? The smarmy atheist says, I don't know, and neither do you. And the point is, you're asking a legitimate question, but it's a legitimate question that your answer to is either, like you say, a bit sort of ad hoc, or a bit unsatisfactory, or a bit silly, or subject to its own analysis and questions. So, can an atheist get an ought from his? No. But like you say, can a theist do it either? I had this debate with Ben Shapiro, and I think I didn't express this particular point well enough on basically everything he was saying. Well, if you're an atheist, free will can't exist. If you're an atheist, there's no way to get ought. If you're and I was just sort of like, totally, you're right, but where the hell are you getting it from? What difference does it make if there's a God? And I think with the ought question, even if, just to be clear, like there are sort of two questions there. I mean, the question I actually have written down is, or rather the subject, the statement, the question of why we ought to do anything aside from arbitrary preference. Right? And so there are sort of two questions hovering here. There's, can atheists have a concept of ought? And I think it's legitimate to maybe say that, the concept of ought can only come from God. But if the question specifically is, can you get an ought from an is? Even God doesn't help you there. All God does is just gives you the ought to derive more ought from.
Yes, I mean, I think, and that makes sense, right? Because it's the problem
I will
with
die out of boredom.
At least this is kind of controversial to say, but I think it's a logical question. Right? You're attempting to deduce an ought from an is.
Yes, I will.
Because of the idea that basically anything within the logical closure of the statements you begin with must in some way be contained within those original statements. Otherwise we wouldn't be doing logic. We'd be doing something else. Or we wouldn't be doing deduction. We'd be doing something else. Would suggest that it is primarily it just is an intractable problem, right? You cannot get an ought from an is. Because if you could deductively go from is to ought, then the ought must have been there originally.
Well, here's a question that I spoke about on a recent Q&A, can you get an is from an ought? Because if you have an ought statement, like, you ought, like, tidy the garden, then it does seem to contain within that the is statement that there is a garden. Even though it's, like, not really there explicitly, because the
like
statement
the
is just
worst
you
shit ever.
ought to, tidy the garden. It seems like you can say, therefore, there is a garden.
Yes, I think that
And if it were a logical problem, if it were like these are just two totally separate logical categories, then it would seem like you wouldn't be able to go either way.
well, so as in there it would be if you were saying you ought to tidy the garden. Someone might respond by saying, well, the reason that you can get a there is a garden from there is because within the you ought to tidy the garden, there is the sub idea that the garden exists, right? It's sort of it's just sort of within the constraints of deductive logic that
But maybe because, like, I mean, it could be incorrect that there exists a garden. Somebody could think you ought to tidy the garden and be wrong, but still derive from that. I guess like, okay, so fine, it sub-contains the, like, assertion that a garden exists. But is there any way for somebody to say that some is statements sort of sub-contain automatic oughts?
Well, I think that is kind of what the theist. That is kind of a theist position, right? Because it is a position that if you're using God to solve morality, then that is part of your position, right? Because you're saying that, well, God's will is good. That's it's not that I think that you can't have mixed is ought statements. It's that I think that if you just have is statements,
What?
getting
There's a
an ought
spike?
seems like it's a
I see.
it seems like a problem that strikes me as likely to be intractable. I'm not saying it definitely is. I could be wrong.
So maybe what theism does here is imparts certain is statements with, like, automatic shoulds. Because if you say something like, it is the case that God wills it,
My god, this level
then you've
sucks.
just automatically said that you should do it.
Yeah, because the
This is like shit.
cashing out the definition of good as God's will.
Yeah. But then it still sounds like if you were being, like, really pedantic about it, you're not getting an ought from an is, you're just getting an ought from
No,
an ought.
you're getting an ought from naught.
I think still not, like, bridging that divide, right?
Yes,
But we spoke about, like, the is ought problem, but I think the more interesting question really is just, like, this concept of ought entirely. Like so the question here wrote, the question of why we ought do anything aside from arbitrary preference. I mean, people will look at an atheist and they'll say, I know you have feelings about the world. I know that you don't like, theft or whatever, but that's just, like, your opinion, man. And
I'm very seen when you looked at me and said, look, atheist, I know you have feelings.
yeah,
Which
well,
is, like, oddly therapeutic.
I don't know. Well, I think you must have them, because I think that's all you have, being a controversial emotivist. But when I think I would agree with this, that there is no question of why we ought to do anything aside from arbitrary preference. To some degree, I quibble with some of the wording.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm more or less an ethical emotivist. So, like, okay, yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to say that maybe an atheist can't answer this. I'm not sure if a theist can too. But I don't actually know what your moral worldview is like.
I go back and forth on this. So I have pretty emotivist, pragmatist intuitions about ethics. But I think that the that's kind of esoteric of me. So, like, to take up the view of someone with significant, because I think it's fair to say that most people have moral realist intuitions, right?
Yeah,
There's, like, most people want to say that murder is wrong is thicker in in really significant ways from just boo murder or just
Well, they want to say it's
any
true.
of the more sophisticated emotivist theories. Yeah, exactly. They want to say it's true. And moreover, there's a governing scope there, right? So I think that I think that this question about
structuring.
You don't
God,
talk yourself into moral intuitions. You talk yourself out of them.
yeah, and I think this question about God
This is
grounding
terrible
morality
structuring.
has. I think the reason that
This
it
is
strikes people
sucks.
as worthwhile
Sucks
as a challenge to
structuring.
atheism is because people are very fond of their moral intuitions, and I think that's fair, right? We kind of want to say that murder is bad because we want to justify stopping people from committing murder, and I think that one thing that the theist does really have going for them with the God grounding morality thing is that it gives very good pragmatic reasons for following morality, because when the stakes are eternal punishment or eternal salvation, you have a really good motivation to follow his commands. And I think and it also gives you a standpoint from which to look at things that is beyond merely intersubjective kind of, oh well, let's look at right and wrong like language and say, okay, well, they're relative to communities, or purely subjective, which is, everyone has their own morals, man. And both of those kind of don't quite do what we want morality to do intuitively, which I think is slightly separate from the question of can atheists come up with explanations of moral language and moral behaviour, which I think, broadly speaking, I think we can. We've got like non-cognitivist theories of moral language. We also just be error theorists and say all moral languages or all moral statements are false. And on the standpoint of moral behaviour, we can talk about evolutionary bases for moral behaviour, cooperation within communities, that sort of thing. So I think it's the former kind of pragmatic concern that theists are worrying about. Because I think oftentimes this is pitched as theism grounds objective morality, and I sort of don't know if that's true, because standardly, I think about subjective and objective as agent relative and not agent relative.
Sure.
And by definition, divine command theory is agent relative. It's relative to one agent. But pragmatically, that one agent is special in a way that allows you to do all of the pragmatic stuff.
Having said that, I do think that all religious language is analogical, including probably words like agent. God is not an agent, in the same way that God is not powerful, God is not loving, God is not, God is not any of these things.
We've got to be really careful here, though, right? Because if we understand God too much by analogy, then it becomes very difficult to articulate what a theist believes.
The fundamental ethical problem is that there is no really sufficient way to capture what God is. He is ineffable. He can't be contained into language, and basically the only real authority that a Christian can have, for example, to use particular analogies like words like powerful and loving, is because they've got them through revelation. Because Jesus used those words, for example, and so they must be accurate to some degree, right? But it's just, if it's truly impossible to sort of comprehend what we're really talking about, then we're going to use analogy. And so when you say, subjective means agent related, or however you phrase it.
381.
Yes, I understand what you mean, and I sort of wanted to raise this point as well, that it's objective because it's grounded in God's agency. Well, what makes God's agency special? Well, maybe because it's not actually agency in the same sense. Maybe that's just a word we're using to capture that God is not just some amorphous blob, but something like a person.
I suppose I think that there's a kind of steering between a rock and a hard place type thing going on here generally with kind of definitions of God, because let's just think about belief in terms of the possibilities that you're excluding. So this is how belief is defined in epistemic logic. It's nice. It's a lovely kind of relatively neat system whereby, okay, so if I believe that you are sitting in front of me right now, what that means is in all of the possible worlds that I'm considering when I'm making decisions, you sitting in that chair in front of me is in every one. And we could contrast this to say, if I knew that you were in Glasgow or London, but I didn't know which, then one of the possible worlds I would consider would have you in Glasgow and the other would have you in London. And I think the trouble,
this is
there is a danger in making God too ineffable. I think this is like a kind of a nice epistemological internal tension in some theistic definitions of God. Whereas if you make God too ineffable because of all of his greatness, then the possible gods, the open possibilities for what God is, start to broaden and broaden and broaden. And on the far end of this, you've got kind of something that looks almost like atheism. If you were to say that God is totally ineffable, you're basically saying, well, there's something out there, but I don't know what it is. And that is like a hair's breadth from atheism. That is, because you're basically saying, oh, there's a placeholder, there's a variable to answer these questions, but I don't know anything about it. But interestingly, this is in tension with God's greatness, right? Because if God is so much greater than us, then also it makes sense that we wouldn't be able to find out everything about him. So there's a kind of, so again, there's steering between a rock and a hard place. I quite like this. It's one of the kind of, it's a fun internal tension within theistic conceptions of God that I think is underexplored. Like, I don't really hear people talk about this. Like the idea that if you make God too great and too ineffable and define too many things by analogy, then it becomes very hard to believe in him in any sense where you've narrowed down the possibilities, right? Because if you make him too ineffable, then you're like, well, it could be God 1 or God 2 or God 3 or God 4, all the way to like God n. And it's like, well, if you left open an infinite number of possible gods that your description of God could latch onto, there's an awful lot of bet hedging going on.
Yeah, so like God is the the truest thing I've ever known. He's more real to me than
Basically
real
playing.
is. He's touched my life, and he's like, oh, what's he like? I have absolutely no idea. What kind of being is it? I don't know. Like, what are some of his properties? I cannot put them into words. I have literally no idea. It does begin to sound a little bit like, okay, like, is this really the sort of the truer than true thing for you? But then I understand why people would then use language like that. They would say, like, you know, this person is so real to me in a way that I just can't quite, like, put my finger on. It would be as if you were the only person in the world who's in love, or who has, like, a really good friend even, and everybody else are just, like, people who interact as we do,
my
but,
God,
like,
this
they don't
level
care
sucks.
about each other really. They just sort of get on with their own life and do their own thing purely,
47
like,
versus
rationally. And you say,
Soccer.
like, I've just experienced this thing, this connection to this person. So, okay, well, what kind of connection? Like, I don't know. And they're like, oh, is it like a reciprocal thing? Is it like you do it to them
No.
because they do it for you? It's like, well, like, actually kind of in a way, but no, because it's not motivated by that. It's kind of like, yeah, and you'd be trying to explain it, and you end up having to sort of use analogies to the way that they live. You'd have to talk in terms of reciprocal function and, like, you know, hedonism and how it makes you feel good and that kind of stuff. But it's not quite the same, you know? But just because you couldn't explain it wouldn't mean that, like, you know, it's a hair's breadth away from not being in love at all, right?
I suppose the only difference there is that in the love example, you've got direct access to the reference of your sentence, right? You can say, at the very least, you can gesticulate your own feelings. Well,
I think that's what people-
Wittgensteinian worries aside. Yeah, but if somebody's gesticulating their own
what
feelings
religion
about
do,
God,
right?
right?
Yeah.
Then that's fine. But then the referent they have
17
direct
versus
access to is their
lot.
feeling, not God, right? It's
Mm.
as in at the very least, as in within some conceptions of theism, their referent would be God.
It's
but
not for seconds.
at the very least, without assuming that at the outset, they would be talking about, you know,
Argo's
the
fixed
thing they have
now.
direct access to is their feeling of the divine. But if they're trying to pick something out in the world in the same way that, like, might pick something out in the world by, or I might pick Shakespeare out by describing him as the writer of Hamlet or something like that, then it seems like there might be a narrowing down issue going on there, which I'm not suggesting it's insoluble. You could, for instance, take a different theory of reference and say, well, I'm having direct contact with God, so I'm picking out that, or something like that. So I'm not suggesting it's insoluble. I just think it's
Not
an
so
underexplored
fast.
internal tension.
Sure.
Sweetheart.
Before we move on, I suppose briefly, do you give any credence to
Not so fast.
atheist, moral realist positions? By moral realism, I mean the idea that morality is a real thing, that moral claims can be true or false.
I suppose I don't.
I mean, people will say, what about utilitarianism? What about Kantianism? What about, you know, or like, I guess a sort of atheistic Kantianism? You know, what about, like a sort of atheist virtue ethics, maybe, could kind of work, you know? What do you think about these ideas?
Well, they're not contradictory. So it's not an implication of atheism that you can't have moral realism. It is more that.
Are you sure about that?
I'm reasonably sure. As in, I don't think you could derive a contradiction from saying there are some things that are good and there is no God. I mean, again, I think Plato's like a
what
good
speed
example
is
of this in
that?
the sense that, you know, I think Plato broadly is theistic, but the form of the good is doing so much of the heavy lifting in his philosophy, in his, like, ethical philosophy, that you kind of, God is kind of a, you know, it's a bit of a loose cog. Right? In the Republic, he says that gods are fully good, but, like, the form of the good does a lot of the philosophical legwork there. So, and that would be an atheistic position. It wouldn't be a materialist position, but it would be an atheistic position whereby you have moral realism. I think that we run into more difficulties when we look at the kind of methodological constraints that tend to lead people to atheism, which I think also tend to lead people to not to moral realism. Like J.L. Mackie in Inventing Right and Wrong raises this. He has the argument from Quinn, where he basically says, well, moral properties, if they exist, are really queer. They're very, very odd. We can't seem to see them directly in the same way we can see loads of other properties. We feel them in a way that we feel them, but their reference is outside of our feelings. You know, I learn things by feeling all the time. I might learn that I'm angry, or learn that I'm happy, or learn that I'm sad. But I'm learning that something is right from the way that I'm feeling about something. And Mackie basically says this is so disanalogous with the other ways that we learn things. that if we're going to stick by broadly empiricist principles, we ought not to be moral realists. And I think that's the line of argument.
Yeah, that's
where where a lot of then atheist worldviews would struggle to come up with moral realism. And it's broadly my argument for not being a moral realist, right? It's so it convinced me. So that I think that's where the tension comes in. It's not that I think that atheism implies moral anti-realism. It's that I think that the same steps that get you to atheism often get you to not believing in moral realism.
Cool. Next question. How can you explain sensus divinitatis? Which I believe is a term coined by John Calvin to describe the sense of the divine that sort of seems to exist within people. Muslims have the concept of fitra, this pulling towards God, that even if you don't personally feel it, maybe you've talked yourself out of it or something. It does seem anthropologically that wherever we look, people tend to have some kind of sense of the sacred and the profane and the numinous and the religious. If that does not actually latch on to something real,
maybe this one
why do we have it?
So again, I feel like the theist has a very good answer to this question, which is that we have it because it's accurate.
I need music.
But remember, this is not a series of questions that theists have a more ready and obvious answer to than atheists. It's questions that atheists cannot answer. I think it's rather presumptuous to say that, or to imply that atheists simply cannot explain why we may have developed a sense that does not latch onto something real.
Oh yeah, I mean, there are all sorts, as in you could come up with all sorts of explanations. You could talk about how it might have some sort of evolutionary advantage. One of my friends, who's a biologist, sent me an article the other day that was talking about the use of religion in sort of like social cohesion, and also the idea that I can't remember the exact wording of this. He'll kill me because I'll just butcher this. But talking about how the sense of a religious theistic God is very useful for things like having a sense of fulfillment and love in your life. Kind of, it's like a kind of stand-in person that is always there and can be supportive and sort of present and can fulfill that psychological need. And I sort of think that this is a point where, of course, the theist would say this is exactly what the theist would predict. It's just also not what the atheist would not predict. The sensus divinitatis, if I'm saying that correctly. It is sure it's not implied by atheism in the same way that it's implied by theism, but atheism would not be an expected observation of a world without God that we wouldn't have a belief about God. In the same way that it wouldn't be an expected observation of a world without chairs that we would never have a belief about chairs.
But it does seem, well, this is more or less a version of the argument from Desire that C.S. Lewis advanced famously.
This is mere Christianity.
I think so, yes. Yeah, I'm almost certain it's from Mere Christianity, where Lewis points out that we have this desire. I mean, he's not speaking on like an anthropological sense, analysing humans. He just sort of says, any person who really pays attention to their own desires will find within themselves and find very strongly a desire for something that's not of this world. And if I find myself with a desire for something that cannot be satisfied by this world, the only or best explanation is that I was not made for this world, that it's satisfied by something else. And an expanded version of this is to say, look, from an evolutionary perspective, people want to say, oh yeah, but it's just a sense that we've evolved. Like, why did we evolve hunger? To help us get food. Why did we evolve tiredness so that we could sleep? Why thirst? It'd be strange indeed if we had all developed this perpetual hunger, even though there was no such thing as food.
Something weird.
I think that
if there was nothing that could actually satisfy us, in other words.
Well, I think that the atheist response to that would be, well, there is something that satisfies our desire for a belief in God, and it's a belief in God. And nobody disputes the idea that theists exist, right? I mean, that would truly be I know some theists have argued that atheists don't exist, but I've never heard an atheist argue that theists don't exist.
Yeah.
That would be radical. Somebody should do a paper on that, I feel like that we don't have enough philosophy papers that are published just to kind of say something batshit and then leave.
Well, I've often thought about the fact that, how Jordan Peterson says, Like, you're not really an atheist, man. Like, he once actually said, oh, you think you're secular? Are you in a museum? Are you looking at art? Well, what makes you think you're secular then? He sort of has this vision, and again, I did a whole video trying to understand his religious philosophy where something like that begins to make sense, but I've often thought, like, people do the same thing in the other direction. Like, people don't act religiously, and the example I always give is when they mourn people's death.
Yes, yeah, does that make sense if somebody's... I mean, I remember really annoying... I went to Sunday school as a kid. I remember really annoying the very, very friendly young man running it when I was like 6 or 7, because they were talking about like sin and the idea of, well, when you're Christian, you're free of sin, and then like you get to go to heaven if you're free of sin. And I remember being like, mate, why did you let me live past my christening? You could have... Hell sounds like it is enough worth avoiding.
Yeah.
You should have killed me after you christened me.
Yeah, it could have done you a favour. I mean, yeah,
He's based.
it is strange the way people treat death and react to death if they truly believe in an afterlife. In Twelfth Night, Olivia's mourning her brother's death, and the fool comes up to her and says, I'm going to prove that you're a fool. And she says, go on then. And he says, like, why are you crying, why are you upset? And it's because my brother's dead. And she says that he's in heaven, and he says, I think he's probably gone to hell.
Bro, Christians are so fucking dumb. It's so illogical. So you're a Christian, you believe in hell and heaven, and you believe that you're whoever a close person went to heaven, and yet you still cry. What? So you're not a Christian. You don't believe in heaven and hell, or do you just believe in certain parts from your religion? Well, that's dumb.
He goes, no, he's in heaven. And he goes, well, more fool you for mourning someone who's in heaven. and it jumped out at me because it was a sort of Shakespearean way of putting the point that I'd been making for a while, which is that, like, what are you mourning for? Okay, like, Alex, you're being totally naive, and you're not considering that people are just upset that they're going to be separated from the person they love. But that's not right either, because if I found out that I was never going to be able to speak to you again, Joe, I'd be pretty upset about that. Like, if you were going on like an expedition to Mars or something, and for some reason there was no communication, and I literally would never see you again, I'd be pretty upset about that. But if I found out, especially if you were the one on the ship, like, if I found out after you take off, and I'm never going to speak to you again anyway, that the ship just like exploded and you're now dead, I think I'd be upset in a different way. It would like change the sadness that I feel, right? And so intuitively to me, it can't just be the separation. There has to be something stronger about the death itself. And when I made a reel about this, people in the comments were sort of saying, tell me you don't understand emotions without saying you don't understand emotions, or so, this kind of stuff, just sort of as if like I'm being really stupid. Oh, he just doesn't get it. But it's like, the point is I do get it. I do get, like, of course you're going to be emotional, of course you're going to be upset, but why would you feel that way if you truly believed in the way that you think you believe that this person's gone to heaven?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I once met at a pub a Christian antinatalist, which is a fascinating, like, to say. I think he had to kind of, and I'm sure that this is just like heresy, but he was a reformed Christian, as in, like, following reformed theology and believed in predestination. He said, well, if I think that God has only chosen a few people, I don't want to have kids because chances are they're going to go to hell, and I would love my kids. And I remember thinking, oh wow, that's because it just is a worldview that's so unfamiliar. I remember actually, that kind of is in the logical extension of both loving your children and the idea of.
I mean, Christians are certainly encouraged.
Well, no, but then it conflicts would go forth and multiply.
Yeah, but then I don't know if that's like a commandment.
This doesn't look possible.
Like Paul was celibate, at least ostensibly. He says he was, and like seemed to think that celibacy was a good thing. He says at one point that it's best to be as I am, but if you really can't keep your hands off each other, then at least go and get married.
That's so dumb.
Like Jesus himself is probably celibate, probably doesn't have a wife, depending on which sort of esoteric Gnostics and people that you speak to. And so, like, it doesn't seem like it can't be, in other words, a Christian necessity that you must have children, because otherwise Paul would be this great sinner, Jesus would be this great sinner. So maybe there could be some track to that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I've never considered it before.
No,
but
no,
I do
neither
think there's
have I.
something a little bit sort of too game theoretical about it that sort of misses what's important. About,
What is it? Well, I suppose I think
about
that's the
kids
job that
and
antinatals
children.
generally get, isn't it? That
Maybe.
But I'm sure that they'd say that's not an argument. That's just you saying I want kids.
Yeah, it's interesting that. Yeah, I suppose you might be doing them a favour by sort of saving them the trial altogether. I suppose the Christian would say that communion with God is such an infinite good that it's worth running the risk.
Yeah,
But then I don't even know if that is true.
Well,
that it would be worth it even then. That's an interesting point. But okay.
Yeah, what was the question?
We were talking about
Divinitatis.
we were talking about sensus divinitatis and how you were saying about there being people who. Let me actually think.
Oh yes, the atheist answer to why do we have the atheist answer to C.S. Lewis's challenge of like, well, why would we evolve hunger if we don't have food? Is to say, well, we don't hunger after God, we hunger after a belief in God. If the belief is doing for an atheist, the belief is doing the explanatory work rather than God doing the explanatory work.
But then why would we have a desire for a belief in something which doesn't exist?
I mean, it's on. I mean, I'm gonna. It does seem like there are examples where we potentially have this. I mean, I'm gonna butcher some like psychological literature here, so I'm probably getting this wrong. I'm gonna preface that, but I remember reading a couple of papers about self-judgment and the idea that humans, on average, overestimate themselves in a whole host of ways, and they asked people questions about themselves and then tested those attributes, and basically they found that people would overestimate themselves in a whole host of ways. I can't remember the exact properties, but I think one of them was like how attractive they are, and when they tested them, they found that they were overestimating themselves. But the only people that didn't were people who were like depressed, and that they had a fairly accurate view of themselves. This explained to me by a professor when I was in third year. I remember thinking, God,
I wonder which way around that was. For them. Was it like because they were depressed, they were more accurate, or because they had a more accurate view of themselves, you just get depressed?
But one thing that this does demonstrate, potentially if this finding still holds, it could be really out of date now, is that it is possible that there would be beliefs that are suited for surviving and thriving that nonetheless are not true.
This is actually the exact example that Richard Dawkins gave to me in response to the same challenge. Was
really?
Precisely that consideration about people who think they're more attractive than they are. But attractiveness is still a thing. It's still a metric which you can place yourself on legitimately or illegitimately, right? If God just doesn't exist, then the desire for him, it's not like you desire him like to be slightly bigger than he actually is, or you know what I mean? Like it's just like this thing that doesn't exist at all, and yet you develop this desire for it.
This one is possible.
Richard Dawkins
to
also then said,
practice.
well, you can desire all sorts of things. I mean, like a person might desire to mate with an attractive, famous supermodel, but it's never going to happen.
But I probably shouldn't try.
The supermodel exists, right? And it does seem like it's actually quite difficult to come up with an analogy for something that we would claim, that we wouldn't dispute people almost universally desire in some sense, and yet maybe doesn't exist.
Yes, I suppose it depends. If you cast it in terms of propositions, the proposition that you are more attractive than you are is just as false.
Yeah, sure.
As the idea that God exists. So like that. But if you're cashing out in terms of objects, I can see why that might. I mean, one thing I suppose you could say in response to that, I'm not entirely convinced by this response I'm about to give, but would be the idea that, well, if God is the maximal point of things like intelligence and goodness and X, Y, and Z, then a desire after that would just be an extreme desire after loads of things we already desire in everyday sense. And that might be potential. I mean, that's kind of an ill-formulated
but that's also something that Dawkins and I sort of discussed, this idea that there are things that we desire in the world that we've just sort of turned up to 11 or sort of abstracted or formed into this one great big archetype. I must say it does seem mysterious to me. It'd be as if I'm saying like, I think that like food is an illusion. I don't think it exists. And you're like, well, hold on, like I feel like I can see it, and I'm like, yeah, that's just because it's an evolutionary adaptation that you like get this illusory sense that food exists. And you're like, well, why would that? Like, what possible reason would there be for that? And I'm like, well, by believing, there's obviously good reasons that we can have. Like, if we believe that there's food there, then we can like come together to eat it together, and so we develop this universal sense of hunger that yeah, like everybody everywhere has the sense of hunger, but it's totally just an evolutionary adaptation, man. And it's because, you know, by evolutionarily inventing this illusion of food, we get to like eat meals together, and we get to spend time together, and we get to go hunting, and we get to do all this kind of stuff, you know. Like, it would just seem really strange that we've all just got this desire for this thing, which we also think is actually fulfilled in many cases, but it's just completely illusory.
Yes, no, I think that's fair. But although I suppose with the food thing, you directly experience food, and so you're arguing that direct
God,
experience
right?
is actually no, that is
People
a fair
directly
point.
experience as God, but you just say that it's an illusion, and I'm saying you experience the food in front of you, but it's just an illusion. Your brain is just tricking all of your sense data into thinking that there's something there.
I suppose there are differences of degree rather than differences of kind here,
It's
in the sense
stupid
that
analogy, but
no,
you get what I'm saying.
I do get what you're saying. Is in like with the food thing, because I can verify it with other, but also it's with other people's. Like, as in, I think that if everyone, if people could publicize their religious experiences, in the sense, if one of my very good friends is a very very committed Catholic, and he often explains when he takes Eucharist, sometimes this feeling overcomes him, and I was like, yeah, if you could make that feeling public in a qualitative sense, you could beam that into everyone else's head, I'm sure I would believe in God.
Also, in fairness, like if people actually died as a result of not believing in God, in the same way that they die from not eating food, that would probably
also
do something.
This also tugs at the question of utility of belief. Like, are there legitimate reasons to believe in? Like, say that belief in God is useful and fulfilling. Is that a legitimate reason to believe in it, even if it's not true?
Yes. Well, here's another question. Provide me with a single civilization that has ever succeeded under an atheistic paradigm. Also, name me a civilization that has come into being without a preceding binding myth. So this practical question, like, how does the atheist respond to the fact, like implied in this question, that there's never been a successful atheistic paradigm, and that there's never been a successful civilization that hasn't had some kind of like mythological founding?
I suppose that, I mean, obviously I'm not an anthropologist, so all of these answers are going to be terribly unreliable, and you shouldn't listen to me. But
thanks for watching, everybody. I mean, the first thing I would point out here is that this at least implies that, like, I mean, the way the question is said, also name me a civilization that has come into being without a preceding binding myth. Granted that it might not be true.
Also, preceding is interesting there, right? Because I suppose there might be a sort of chicken egg problem. Something interesting that one of Nietzsche's interesting observations is he thought that we often got causes and effects really confused. So, like, you know, again, come on to existential issues in a sec, but like he thought that it wasn't that nihilistic people. He said that it wasn't that a belief in God led. Disbelieving. It wasn't necessarily that a disbelief in values led to nihilism. It was that people became nihilistic emotionally because of the disorganization of their wills, and then it didn't make sense for them to value things. Like, you know, that he had a kind of, and he would talk about the active nihilist, who was, you know, simplifying somewhat, but broadly someone who just thought, well, my will inherently has value. Like, what do you mean my will doesn't have value? I want something. What more can you ask of me? And so, to bring it back to the question, one potential atheist answer is to say, well, yeah, if you get a group of people together in a room of really any significant size, they'll come up with all sorts of like awesome ideas, and it could be that civilization begets a founding myth rather than a founding myth begets a civilization.
I forgot.
Like, preceding is an interesting word there, because I think clearly these two things are going to be interrelated. Right? If I get 100 people together on a desert island, I'm sure they're going to form religion, right, as a thing. And I think that is like the interesting problem for the atheist. Is like, well, why does this happen so much? But regarding whether there's a preceding myth, I think it's probably kind of a mutually interdependent thing there. I mean, can a civilization survive without a shared myth? I think is an interesting question. It's one that I don't have the answer to.
Yeah, I mean, I doubt it.
Why are we
totally pessimistic about the idea of a nation in any meaningful sense, or certainly a civilization being able to be sort of cohesive and survive and thrive without having something that bonds them together more than like the immediacy of their like day-to-day sense experience, right? Yeah. And in fact, I think for a lot of atheists, they hypothesize that this is why religion is invented, by the mind, by, you know, the collective psychology of mankind and womankind, because of course, like, we sort of need things to tie us together. That's like the whole reason it's invented. And so whether the questioner says, keep calling them questions, but a lot of these are just statements. Provide me with a single civilization that has ever succeeded upon under an atheistic paradigm. Like, maybe I can't. An atheistic paradigm, no. As people often conflate the idea of, like, secularism and politics with atheism. and
I
politics,
did
right?
not.
Like, an atheistic
Something happened to my brain.
government might be like the USSR, which, like, people bring that up as a point against atheism all the time. It was not a secular government. A lot of people describe it as secular, even though it's like actively, like proactively persecuting religious people, as if that in any way fits into a definition of secular. But it's certainly atheist. Yeah, I can't think of one, and maybe that is because, I'll just grant, it's because, like, it doesn't work. Right, let's just say, fine, let's just agree with the implication of the question. No civilization can function under atheism. That is as well answered by saying that's because atheism is false, as saying, and that's why, although there is no God, people have to invent one.
Yes, but the other thing is that it doesn't strike me as actually a necessary implication of God exists, that no civilization could survive without a belief in God.
Yeah, sure.
But it is an implication of the atheist explanation. So, like, in some ways, there's actually a strength of the atheist.
Yeah, I think you might be right there, because God could exist, but if God existed, it would seem like even if people didn't believe in him, he could still, in theory, like, design it so that civilization can still be stable.
At the very least, it doesn't fall out of theism as a kind of obvious implication that no civilization survive without God. But I think this is an interesting question for atheists.
Yeah.
Are we being terribly irresponsible by spreading our
maybe, like,
corrosive doctrine?
It's true. It's true, at least to the extent that, I mean, there are studies to suggest that, like, religious people are, like, happier, that they have better sex lives, that there's all kinds of things, and so, like, there is this case to be made that, like, even if you don't think it's true, like, why would you talk people out of it? Like, to what end? And you can say, oh, because, I value truth and stuff. Like, really? Like, more than you value people's well-being? Well, I mean, maybe, but then I don't know. Like, it is a question that does have to be addressed. I mean, I know you sort of say it a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's really true. It's worth thinking about.
An interesting implication of basically potentially of an atheist worldview, but also just generally pretty much any worldview that doesn't have a very, very good metaphysical mirror between the human mind and the structure of reality is that there could be things that are true that are just unbearable. It could be that you discover truths that send you mad. And arguably theism does have a way around that. Theism could really neatly sync up truth and utility with the idea of a loving God. Truths are useful because the world has been designed benevolently, and that's like that is an explanatory framework that helps.
Oh no.
Square that circle. I think the very interesting question when you remove that is, well, there could be things that are true that are really not beneficial to believe. But there are also atheistic theories, like there's kind of global pragmatist theories that attempt to tie truths back to utility. So kind of truth is like abstracted away from things that are useful, even if there are individually things that are true that are not useful. So there's some extra work.
I don't think it's controversial to suggest that there could be things which are false that are beneficial for society to believe in. And so, again, considering that we're asking here for questions that atheists cannot answer, like, okay, it's a confronting question. Well, why hasn't atheism ever worked on a civilizational level? Like, I don't know, let's talk about that, but is it a question that atheists can't answer? I don't think so. I mean, think about the fact that, for example, I don't think that civilizations can survive without all other kinds of myths. Like, for example, like belief in the rule of law, like belief in your constitution, belief in your like nation's ethic, right? It's very difficult for a nation to survive if there isn't like general like agreement on that. Like if we were still living in like a real monarchy, but like the monarchy was really like the absolute monarch with proper power. Yeah, the kind of monarchy that I would like to see, and
not the kind of limp monarchy we have at the moment.
Exactly. Then like
No.
okay, like you probably need most of the population to sort of believe in the concept of monarchy in order for it to work. Now, I could be sat in that society and be like, well, obviously monarchy is like ridiculous, and it's not true that this person is ordained by God. The chrism oil being
This
rubbed on
level
the
is
chest
cool.
does not transform this person into some sort of like demigod with like, you know, right to read. None of that's true, right? And people would probably say, okay, well, how are those, you know, Republican societies working out? How's France going? You know, go and look over there.
That was what people wrote around the turn of the
yeah,
18th
exactly,
century.
right? And so, but it wouldn't. All that would tell us is that what we're dealing with here is something like a noble lie. You know, it's like, it's that's an idea from Plato. You know, that the idea that there are certain things which are not true but must be believed by a society for it to function. This is not an old idea, and religion just may be one of those things.
Yeah, I suppose there is obviously the argument that, or at least I think people's response to that sort of thing tends to be, well, that's horribly condescending. And I don't think that's, and I don't think it necessarily has to be horribly condescending. So I think you can make it work by saying, well, it's not that people are too limited to not have a god or something like that. You could just say, well, you know, it's just a good organizing principle. It's not that any individual person, you know, is limited in some way. It's just that when you have people at scale, there are all sorts of things that you need to, like most people don't need a spreadsheet to organize their lives. But if you have 2,000 people, you probably will need a spreadsheet.
Yeah, and it's a bit like the monarchy thing where, you know, if I said, I don't think the monarchy, like, comports with reality in the sense that the claims that people make about divine right of kings and stuff aren't true. Okay, so then we abolish the monarchy and like society just falls apart. Right. At best, I would have to say, okay, maybe we should have kept it anyway. You know, it wouldn't prove to me that actually it was all true.
Yes, that isn't a question atheists can't answer. It might be a question that atheists shouldn't answer.
Yeah,
This is
that's
so
another
cool.
good video idea, actually. Questions atheists should not answer. Let's change gears. Totally different kind of question here. I'm not sure if there's no answer, but I'd be curious to hear an argument for why we are able to trust human intellect and rationality as a reliable guide to truth.
Oh, this is a fascinating one. I've been thinking about this. This has been actually really playing on my mind recently.
How can we trust human intellect to get us to truth? If there's no God, there's no divine guiding principle. Just to sort of lay this out, for the materialist, like, the brain is just a bunch of atoms bumping into each other. Right? It's just like it's kind of like a rock or a piece of wood or something that happens to have developed this weird thing called consciousness. But like, it seems no necessary reason why it would have to be formed in relation to truth. Like, we were just talking a moment ago about how it makes sense to believe certain things that are false because it's like beneficial for us, right? Now, if it happens to be true that actually applies writ large to things like the laws of logic and mathematical truths, we'd literally be incapable of knowing. Because it might be the case that it's not that 2 + 2 = 4, it's that believing 2 + 2 = 4 is beneficial for my survival, and that's why my rationality evolved to believe that kind of thing. And somebody will come along and say, yeah, but hold on, like, you know, it just can't, like, my brain just can't conceive of the opposite. Like, we can know it to be true a priori, and I'm like, that's because that's how your brain evolved, right? There were people who believed that 2 + 2 = 5. It's just that believing that was not beneficial to their survival, and so they died out, leaving only us. Now, people will want to say, like, this is stupid. What do you mean? The reason they died out, and the reason why believing 2 + 2 = 5 was not beneficial to their survival was because it's not true, right? And do you think that that's a good response to this?
I think this is one instance of just a general problem of circular justification in philosophy, and just like sort of so here you've got two claims. You've got one about epistemology and one about ontology, and effectively the question is how are we going to get them to play nice together? And the trouble is, I mean, on the classic Aristotelian model of philosophy, you have a bunch of branches of like the outer branch of the tree, and you get to the middle, and it's metaphysics or ontology, like the stuff that is. This is why Descartes' Meditations on Metaphysics is called Meditations on First Philosophy, because metaphysics is the first philosophy. And I think the trouble is that there is, in practice, there's an interplay. There is mutual dependence between your epistemology and your ontology. Because your ontology will justify your epistemology, but your epistemology has to justify why you believe in your ontology.
What is ontology and epistemology?
So epistemology, like the study of how you can come to know things, and ontology, the study of what is. So my epistemology as in that's a really good example of where somebody has put forward the argument that ontology has undermined epistemology. The idea that we are simply evolved creatures, atoms bumping together, and that's all our brains are, and that's all our rationality is, has undermined, or plausibly undermined, the epistemology. And then and this is kind of fascinating, right? But then you have to assume the reliability of epistemology in order to come to any sort of ontology. Yeah. So when the theist, so it's not just that the theist argument is circular when they would say, oh well, God would ground that. It's like, well, how do you? But prior to God grounding it, how do you know that? What's the preconsidered reliability of your epistemology that has allowed you to know that your reasoning chain from God existing to the reliability of your epistemology and this is sometimes posited as a problem for the theist, but it's not. It's a problem for everyone. It's a problem for everyone, right? It's because of this. It's because what we know is predicated on what we think is, and what we believe is the case is predicated on what we think we can know.
Yeah. So we'll break this down, even if just for your sake, Alex. I could see you looking sort of panicked over there because there's a lot of words, and I think no, don't apologise. That's what we're here for. But I think I want to make sure that I'm understanding what you're saying. There's like a circularity potentially in the God justification and saying, well, I can trust my rationality because God grounds it. That's what Descartes does. Yeah. And one of the most famous criticisms of Descartes' work is known as the Cartesian circle. It's this circle of like, well, if you need God to justify your reasoning ability, how do you reason that God exists in order to justify that reasoning ability? And it sort of goes around in a circle, right? And so think about like the atheist version of this, or the atheist problem here, is really put together best, I think, by Alvin Plantinga, his evolutionary argument against naturalism. So he specifically makes the case that if you believe in evolution, I've talked about this a lot, right? If you believe in evolution, and you're a materialist, assume you're a materialist, you believe in evolution by natural selection. Natural selection selects for survivability. It doesn't select for truth. Which means that if you believe in evolution, you believe that your reasoning faculty has not evolved to be sensitive to truth, but to survivability. Why do you believe in evolution? Well, because you've reasoned your way into it. But the thing you've just reasoned your way into, evolution, has undermined your ability to trust the reasoning process that you've used to reason into it. So he sort of points out that like you can't be a materialist and believe in evolution, because believing in evolution undercuts the reasons you have for believing in evolution. The thing is, right, one of these is a vicious circle and one of them is a virtuous circle. Because for the atheist, you've got this horrible problem where like you've got this weird circle of like well, yeah, okay, like I believe that it's just atoms bumping into each other that has no connection to truth, and that's produced this belief, but it's that belief which has caused this reasoning, and you're getting all messed up. You know, the theist goes around in a circle, but they say, okay, sure, it's circular, but we all have to start somewhere, and everyone's circular in some degree, but my circle is one that says, well, God justifies reason because he's an agent who is, you know, the foundation of truth and gives us access to truth, and yeah, sure, I've used my reasoning faculties to get there, but that circle is like consistent and self-contained and gives you this access to truth, even though it's still circular. It's one that sort of gives you trust in truth.
Yes, I mean, I think that I think that is essentially the core difference with the truth, right? Self-undermining versus self-reinforcing.
Yeah.
I do want to point out the epistemological, ontological thing, because I think oftentimes we sort of pretend that we can ground things more than we can. I mean, you know, you've got Wittgenstein's uncertainty on the shelf. And he has this idea of a hinge statement, which is where a statement you eventually come to where you can neither justify it nor challenge it, because you can only justify propositions with more strongly held propositions, and you can only challenge propositions with more strongly held propositions. So you eventually get something you can't justify or challenge. But yeah, again, and I think that is sort of, that could form a kind of theist way out of this Cartesian circle, where they just say, well, I say you've got to start somewhere. I think that there are a couple of potential responses that an atheist could have. First of all, I should say I genuinely think this is a cracking problem. This is the stuff good philosophy is made of.
Me too, by the way. Like I really like. In fact, often depending on who I'm talking to, right? Because sometimes when I present this argument to people, especially, it's a bit complicated, but it's also a little bit like there are so many little ways that it can be, I guess, like misunderstood or objections that seem like they should work but kind of don't, and so it's a little bit tricky. But like if I'm if I'm talking with somebody who like gets it, this is like my go-to challenge. If someone's like, what do you think's the best argument for like believing in God or something? I'll be like, just check this out. Like, try this on and see what you think.
Yeah, I mean, this idea that our epistemology can become self-undermining, that does keep me up at night. That is, you know, this keeps me up at night more than why is there something rather than nothing.
Yeah.
I think that there are, again, to toy with roots out, because I think that there are potential roots out, but at the same time, each of them is so incredibly controversial. I mean, I suppose actually before I do that, initial observation is that it's not that an atheistic view implies this; it's a materialistic view implies this, or potentially implies this. If there's no kind of breaking reason. So again, for instance, you know, if you like Kant, to incredibly probably butcher Kant, to say that the world is in some way synthetically a priori aligned with the particular faculties of your reasoning, then you don't have to worry about it. But again, that's like, and that's what I mean when I say all the solutions. This is so controversial. Like, yeah, but do you want to swallow the synthetic a priori whole? That's a lot to take, man. So each of these solutions will have massive controversies with them. One is to adopt some form of global pragmatist view. So this is what Hugh Price does, who is a brilliant Australian philosopher, who goes from object naturalism, which is essentially you need to start with studying the world as a natural object, and then he comes to subject naturalism, which is studying the human as a natural object. And then he says, well, if you're studying the human as a natural object, we use all kinds of weird non-natural terminology like truth and the whole of maths, and like loads of stuff that at first glance is a bit non-natural. And so he says, well, if we're going to be consistent naturalists, we need to study the human as a subject
It's so
naturalist problem.
hot.
And so he comes up with an idea of truth, which is the same boat principle, which again, it's been a while since I read Price, so you know, don't quote me on this. But this idea, he takes truth and abstracts it from the stuff that is useful. So he gets around it by in a way that I won't attempt to record the details of, because I know that I would misquote it. Takes the things that are useful to humans and then abstracts truth away from that as the thing that is generally the principles of how we come to have truth is the principles of principle of the stuff that will be useful as a general rule. And sure, it will sometimes break with utility, but it's kind of the best fit we've got. And that's kind of how he gets it. Of course, the difficulty with that is it's a fundamentally anti-realist conception of truth. It is almost idealist in the way that it sets up the human investigative project. But it's a definition of truth that means that we can be sure that, or we can be pretty sure that our reasoning is true, because we've defined truth relative to the human. And this is kind of this touches upon an interesting point regarding generally a pattern that I noticed between atheist and theistic reasoning. Again, you know, to generalize, is that oftentimes you will have the theist want to have something human grounded in metaphysics, and the atheist will often take something that is purportedly metaphysical and attempt to ground it back in the human. So like the classic one is quite a lot of metaphysically minded people will say, well, how does maths work? And they'll want to say something like, well, maths works because it's grounded in these platonic eternal truths. That's why maths works. And lots of less metaphysically minded people want to say something like, well, maths works because we've designed it to work. It's a tool, and we have. If the world was different, maths would be different. And
maybe truth kind of works in the same way.
Yeah. So that would be, again, to just illustrate like general explanatory differences between competing philosophical tendencies or philosophical predispositions. I think that really cuts at something, and I think that, you know, those that are very, very sympathetic to explaining the metaphysical in terms of the human will love something like Price's idea of truth, because it connects something weird and a bit fuzzy and seemingly immaterial, like the truth relation. That's odd on the face of it, right? I can say a statement, it latches on something in the world, and that becomes true. On the face of it, that's kind of really weird and sort of not naturalistic. And Price linking it back to naturalism, I think, would be very satisfying for some people. But on the other hand, you've lost like hardcore realism about truth.
Yeah, I guess in part because of this consideration, just sort of been committed, I think, recently to this kind of view of truth, that becomes like a sort of anti-realist view of truth. That truth is not as traditionally thought of, that there is just this reality that our minds latch onto. I mean, maybe, at least maybe that's the case, it's just that you can't know that that's the case. And sort of the way that you're in practice using words like true and using and sort of granting assent to propositions and saying, I believe this is true, recognizing as a materialist what my brain is, how it evolved, how it functions. Like, I don't think I so much have to like abandon truth as rethink what truth means.
Yes,
But then you hear a theist saying something like, you know, those who don't believe in God, they've abandoned truth, and you're sort of like, maybe.
Well,
maybe
redefine
actually.
truth. I mean, it's also worth noting this type of anti-realism about truth doesn't have the same implications as somebody saying truth is relative, because here truth is not relative, and here truth is not subjective. It's not, you know, it as anti-realist theories of truth go, this is not a bad one, but it's still an anti-realist theory of truth, and that is such a massive pill to swallow. I mean, for instance, this is not saying all statements are false, which, you know, classically is self-contradictory. But you're right. Anti-realism about truth is a really tough pill to swallow. I mean, depending on how good your grounding of truth is in naturalistic principles, it can be that you can get truth to do still lots of the same things that you'd want it to do anyway. But again, it kind of, again, that's what I mean about I think some of these questions are an issue of philosophical predisposition. Because, like, if I was more metaphysically minded, I would just reject that out of hand. I'd say, what do you mean? Like, how is this anti-realist definition of truth useful, if not because it's true? Like, you're saying truth is abstracted utility. Why is it useful? Like, what is ontologically grounding that? And I think that is that philosophical instinct to ground something human in something metaphysical. And again, I feel like it is those competing intuitions clashing in this debate around the grounding of truth.
Next question, moving on. Where do the laws of logic come from?
This is fascinating. One thing is that when I was at uni, my specialty was mathematical logic. It's what I focused on during my final year and then during my masters. So it's a very interesting question. There's a lot of dispute, understandable. Some argue that logic is fundamentally empiricist in founding. So some people argue that the laws of logic are abstracted from observations. We don't see contradictions, so we have the law of non-contradiction. And there are various arguments used to support that. So there was an attempted research program called quantum logic in the 80s by Hilary Putnam, I think. And he modified the classical laws of logic in line with observations from quantum theory about uncertainty principles and stuff. I don't understand quantum physics in the slightest, so I'm going to tread very lightly here. And he was basically saying, well, actually, imagine that his general argument was right. Imagine that you couldn't know position and velocity in general life. Well, we would modify the laws of logic to reflect that, right? You wouldn't be able to, if you knew you wouldn't be able to distribute certain properties, for instance, and stuff like that. So he's saying, okay, well, we would modify the laws of logic in accordance with that. So whether or not you want to modify logic because of observations in quantum mechanics, he's suggesting, well, what this does show is that the laws of logic would be alterable if we encountered certain things in the world. Thus, there is some empirical component to the laws of logic. But that's the epistemological answer for Putnam. For other people, it's intuition, and for others. But there's also the metaphysical problem, which is why do the laws of logic work? And again, you have this kind of human metaphysical directions of explanation where some people say, like Putnam will say, well, the laws of logic work because they are designed to fit the world. We have designed them to fit the world. And then for a lot of people, that's deeply unsatisfactory. So they say, well, why does the world correspond with the laws of logic? How have we been able to do that? Why is the world not chaos and darkness and lots of other nasty, unpredictable things that make logicians nervous? And that's a broadly, and that strikes me as a sensible question, right? And often, the kind of the only answer that somebody who suggests that who's doing the human direction, the metaphysical human direction explanation there, is to say something like, well, if the world had been different, then the laws of logic would have been different, and we would have made different laws of logic. And I can kind of get, I go back and forth on this intuitively, where sometimes I find this incredibly unsatisfying, and sometimes I'm like, okay, maybe there's something in this, because we do things like reason with uncertainty, because we have probability for reasoning with uncertainty. If we were never uncertain about anything, we wouldn't have had probability. There would be no need for it. Likewise, if deduction was always uncertain for whatever reason, like that was just empirically true in the world, as weird as that is to say, then our deductions would have uncertainty attached and stuff like that. So there's an argument that you can say there, but then we're also at this point bumping up against something we talked about at the beginning of the episode, which is what is the limits of possibility. Is it in some sense impossible for the laws of logic to have been different?
Because by the laws of logic, what are we talking about?
Yeah, actually, that's a good point as well, because the laws of logic are themselves kind of controversial.
Right.
So, classically, things like a few uncontroversial laws. Well, as uncontroversial as anything ever is in philosophy. But uncontroversial laws of logic would be if A implies B, then you can infer from A to B. Stuff like that. One of the less controversial ones is the law of non-contradiction. So, not A and not A. So if you have A, you can infer not A.
So something can't be true and false at the same time.
Yeah, basically. I mean, it's very intuitive, right? But there are people that
you say not as in it's true that not brackets
A and not A. So I mean, I don't know if you can make like a little icon pop up on the screen.
we're getting a hard no from our video.
So not A and not A, and close bracket. And there are also more controversial logical laws, like the law of the excluded middle, which is I always get this. Actually, no. Let's just say
something can only be true or false. Only be true or false.
There are two really similar laws here. So one is the law of the excluded middle, and one is bivalence. And for some reason, I always get them the wrong way around. Completely roasted by people.
Well, what's the difference?
Well, so the law of the excluded middle is something is either A or not A. The law of bivalence is any statement is either true or false. And they're clearly connected, but they are different in the way. Well, they're distinct in the way that logicians care about.
I may have been misusing that too. I'm not.
But I mean, I misuse it all the time. I'm meant to know about this.
It's like I always say, whatever, man.
Yeah, exactly.
So here are some examples of the kinds of laws that we're talking about. Right? These kinds of like fundamental, seemingly self-justifying, intuitive, like bases for working with the thought. I mean, like if A implies B, that is like if A then B, A therefore B. Well, how do you know that? It just seems like you're kind of saying the same thing twice.
Yeah, it just has to be true. Yes, like what if you don't have this? What do you have? So one of the quirks of classical logic is that you can and a contradiction implies anything. And my logic tutor in first year used to say that a good way to get your head around this intuitively is, well, if this is true, then anything can be true.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I've been planning on doing a video about this concept. From
the law of explosion.
Ex falso quod.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh man,
it's great. It's great fun. I remember I talked about it in my interview for Oxford, where I was sort of given the definition of a valid argument, and then provided with a valid argument. So for those listening, a valid argument is, at least in some schools of logic, not defined as if the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. That's not what a valid argument is. A valid argument is one where there's no interpretation under which the premises are true and yet the conclusion false.
Yeah.
That's not quite saying the same thing. Right? So the definition of a valid argument is there's no interpretation in which both of the premises can be true and yet the conclusion be false. Right? And so then my tutor my would-be tutor provided this argument that was like, premise 1, it's raining outside. Premise 2, it's not raining outside. Conclusion, Batman has a black cape. Is that valid? And I was like, no. She's like, think about it. I was like, no. So I thought she was trying to trick me. I was like, no. And then suddenly the penny drops. I was like, yes, it's valid, because there's no way which the premises can both be true and the conclusion be false, because there's no way that both the premises can be true, because they contradict each other.
I used to love doing this. I taught.
So it's a valid argument, and what that means is that it follows from it's raining outside and it's not raining outside.
Yeah.
From that, in logic, it follows that Batman has a black cape. And so ex falso quodlibet, I think, means from the false anything, like from a contradiction you can derive anything.
Yeah. So so classically, because when you're defining classical logic, you have a mark for contradiction, and it's normally like an upside down T. And the ex falso quodlibet is from contradiction what you please, and it's just contradiction implies anything. And I mean, it's a very interesting. I mean, I taught logic to first years during my masters, and I used to love doing this. This is my favourite little pullback and reveal over the course of the lessons. And so that's another law of logic. I mean, one thing to bear in mind here is that the laws of logic aren't nearly as uncontroversial as people think they are. So there are power consistent logics, as we were talking about earlier with Graham Priest. I think the trouble, partly this is, and power consistent logics get rid of when a contradiction implies anything, it places limits on what you can infer from contradictions because it allows for contradictions in non-trivial models of it. So yeah, that's yeah. So the laws of logic aren't nearly as uncontroversial as people think, but at the same time, for all intents and purposes, most of the time, classical logic works perfectly well, and we want certain things to really work. Like if A implies B, then if you've got A, you've got B. We really want that to work, because otherwise, what do? I don't know, we just kind of sit in a corner and cry, or at least I'll sit in a corner and cry. Even if no one else will. Everyone else will get on with their lives because they don't need everything in their worldview to be grounded in classical logic. But I do. And but yeah, so that would be, yeah. So this is a real worry, right? And yeah, and theists can make a pretty cool move, which is to say, well, because God has ordered the world according to the laws of logic. But there are, there are a couple of things that I want to potentially talk about here as potential problems for that response, which is that one is that if God is going to be explanatory there, it sort of implies that God could have given the world a different logic, and I think that's really cool. But that in turn raises tensions for classic theistic responses to things like, can God make a stone so heavy he can't lift it? Because the classic theistic response, which I think is perfect and brilliant, that's why I don't really think it's, can God make a stone so heavy he can't lift it? The problem is just to say, well, a stone so heavy God can't lift it doesn't make any sense. It's a self-contradictory property. But of course, if God crafts the laws of logic and God grounds the laws of logic, then in order for that to be explanatory, it kind of seems like God could have made it differently. Because otherwise, it's like, well, if God couldn't have made it differently, then in what sense is he grounding it in a way that, I know, Platonism wouldn't, or it just then becomes a bare fact about immaterial reality rather than material reality. So there's a potential tension there with other potential like theistic responses to alternative problems. And and the second is just to stress that it's probably a bit too extreme to say the atheist cannot explain the laws of logic. But it is probably fair to say that there are genuine difficulties in grounding the laws of logic metaphysically. A lot of the time, philosophers will turn to Platonism for mathematical and logical laws to give them their grounding there. So you say the laws of logic exist in the immaterial plane and are instantiated in the material plane. So the law of non-contradiction is out there in the Platonic realm, and in this world, it is instantiated in the fact that nothing contradicts. There are no contradictory properties. And I think that's fine. I mean, it strikes me as at least as good an explanation as the theistic one. For the reason I gave before, is that it seems like the agency of God must be pretty limited in explaining this particular thing, because otherwise, theological reasoning, why God did one thing rather than another thing and stuff like that, becomes very, very difficult. Because if God isn't bound by the laws of logic, and they're kind of downstream of his will, then that becomes, then it's kind of, you make God really, really inscrutable.
Yeah, maybe God does exist and also doesn't exist. It's just that the one that did exist created this law of logic which binds everything else.
Exactly. If God isn't bound by the laws of logic and instead they are downstream of him, then there's loads of theological reasoning becomes potentially really, really tricky.
Yeah, and that would mean that the theist has as much of a question as to sort of where this comes from. If it binds God, it comes from God.
And I think this is really, really nice, right? Because there is a difference between God grounding the laws of logic and God grounding the laws of like morality. Because logic is plausibly prior to God. Even in a theistic worldview, it is one of the few things that is plausibly prior to God.
Yeah, it seems prior to thought.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the trouble with any kind of grounding of the laws of logic, atheistic or theistic, is that, I mean, first of all, you're going to use logic to get there, because what else are you going to use?
Yeah.
Right? If you don't have that, you're either going to shout or just take a wild stab in the dark and then not be able to evaluate it. So there's that aspect to it. And also, just that whatever you pick to ground logic, if you're trying to ground logic in something prior to logic, then the thing that you're grounding logic in becomes really difficult to examine, because it sort of seems like it wouldn't be itself bound by the laws of logic. Because if it was, then, well, it's bound by the laws of logic. Well, where's its binding coming from?
So a difficult question to answer all round.
Yeah, I mean, amazingly difficult. I mean, any question that goes that attempts to take a step before you get to logic is going to be horribly difficult to answer. But I do think genuinely this is not just a problem for atheists. It's a problem for theists. It's a problem for anyone who wants to use logic.
Yeah. Again,
Why does it work?
relevant here is the Cartesian circle. I mean, Descartes tries to say that God exists, and so the sort of our trust in even our logical laws, our mathematical truths, can be grounded in the fact that we know that God exists. But he's using reason to prove the existence of God, and using God to justify the existence of reason. There seems to be a circle. In fact, Pascal once wrote that he could never forgive Descartes because he sort of uses God, he like constructs God to be this basis of his worldview, so he can justify like reason and logic and stuff, and then just has no more use for him ever again. He's just this sort of like,
that's so true.
he's just this like stepping stone that he uses to sort of, you know, to start walking, and then he just leaves him in the dust. And Pascal was really annoyed at Descartes.
I'd never thought of that, but that's so true. He absolutely does.
But he arguably is working in a circle just as the atheist would have to do as well. So again, it's one of those questions that maybe atheists can't answer it, but if they can't, reasons to think the theists can't either.
But it's also worth noting that the atheist, whereas before we had the atheist was in a potential vicious circle. Here, the atheist seems to be in, if anything, a kind of neutral circle.
Yes,
it's like kind of again, because partly this is just because we are now so deep into not being able to use reasoning apparatus if we're going prior to logic that I'm again, as I said at the beginning, my intuitions kind of run out a little bit.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'd be interested to know what people's intuitions are with something like this.
Oh yeah,
But,
and
you know,
I'm sure that they're already letting us know in the comments. I have a quite simple, straightforward one next.
Yeah.
What is consciousness?
Oh yeah. No. Oh yeah. I reckon we could probably rattle off a few answers.
Wrap this up in
This is like
30
the-
seconds.
They are
mystery.
not
But
vibrating.
in a way, maybe we can, because of course, it's a bit of a cop-out, but it is worth saying that you can be an atheist whilst not being a materialist.
Yes, I mean this is almost like the kind of runs like that would apply to the logic one. Indeed, loads of ones.
You can believe that consciousness is this strange, immaterial. You can believe in the existence of the soul. You can believe in all of that kind of stuff, and just not believe in like an agential God overseeing it all. It would be quite weird.
Yeah,
maybe.
it would
It would
be-
still be like weirder that there wasn't some like creator, non-material thing, but like it's possible to be of that persuasion.
Yeah.
So it's worth noting that. But I think
Yeah.
really the question here, put in the context of atheists not being able to answer it, is like consciousness seems like a very strange thing to expect if there is no intention behind the universe, and if there is no immaterial element to the universe. Because consciousness seems like it's immaterial. It seems, I mean, we can answer this as if we were looking for questions that materialists can't.
Yes,
answer, you
yeah,
know, like
exactly.
consciousness is very strange. I've talked about it a lot recently. People who've been listening to my recent material will know that I'm just bemused by consciousness.
Well, it's one of the weirdest things. You know, as in, it's a bit like the laws of logic in the sense that it's one of the weirdest things and one of the most obvious things. What are you going to do to like? It's like I think it's Paul Churchland is a limited materialist, so he thinks that consciousness doesn't exist, and he thinks about it. His point is more nuanced than that. But like, I remember reading one of his papers and being like, "What do you mean? How do I even go about disbelieving in consciousness?
Consciousness is
This
an
seems like
illusion."
yeah, it's like how do you expect me to not believe in consciousness? It seems like one of the only things that is really self-evidently there.
Yeah.
Again, on par with something like the laws of logic.
No.
It's arguably it's the filter through which I view everything else in the world.
Yes.
If I'm not conscious, like where do I begin? And
I
you know,
have
again,
noticed.
you're right. I think that the difference here, though, I think with consciousness compared to something like
Oh, the
morality,
level looks different now.
and why I
wonder
think
why.
that the atheist has a more sensible anti-materialist position here. Like I don't think it kind of gets I don't think it gets us in as many epistemological binds. Is that we have direct empirical evidence of consciousness. So if something is going to be the exception to the materialist rule, it's going to be consciousness, because if the materialist rule is broadly downstream of this kind of broad naturalist empiricist approach, then if there's going to be an exception, consciousness is going to be the least controversial one.
I don't think, and people might expect me to have some. The thing is, I'm not a neuroscientist,
No, me neither.
and I think that this is a relevant field, right? Like there may be these wonderful explanations for what consciousness is on a purely materialistic framework. I've tried to sort of discover them. I've tried to interview people who might be able to give me some ideas, and I've been left sort of wanting. And I'm just perfectly happy to say that I'm like agnostic on the question of materialism because of consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of approaching the same sort of place. I mean, Francisco Varela is a neuroscientist who's been looking at like correlations between like certain mental states and certain like physical
This
brain
shit
states and stuff
is
like that. But again,
getting
it's
so fucking tricky.
we're so
oh
far
my
away from a kind of
God.
reductive
Yes.
materialist program of consciousness, and you know, I'm not suggesting that it definitely can't happen. I don't quite buy into the like Thomas Nagel, David Chalmers. Oh, nothing physical in principle could explain consciousness.
Yeah.
You know, it strikes me that it could, if we're just like blue sky thinking, then there could be a kind of future scientific paradigm that is as dissimilar from our current way of thinking about consciousness as like the mechanistic view of the world was from the teleological Aristotelian view of the world.
I was
And,
just thinking that. Yeah.
you know, just like this kind of and that's sort of, but to a certain extent that's like idle, right? Because like scientific revolutions almost by definition are pretty unpredictable. As in, you can't predict what they're going to be in advance. You might be able to predict when they're going to be. But so that would be like my first point, is that I wouldn't. I think that it's probably. I'm not convinced that materialism is like completely blown to pieces there. But I also think that it will be unwise to say that it survived it, because it hasn't yet. Yes. There are some cracking responses to this sort of worldview though. There's a guy called Galen Strawson.
Yeah.
You know.
I get him mixed up with Peter Strawson, one
yes,
son
of
of the
course,
other. And
are they related?
I think
That's so cool.
And-
I mean,
and
presumably
Peter's-
Galen's the son of.
yeah, because
Peter,
then I must have met Galen.
I mean, yeah. I mean, Peter Strawson's awesome. And Galen Strawson, I think, is also very cool, though I only really know him for this. This idea that he suggests that he is an atheist and he is a naturalist, and he just thinks that
Bruh.
consciousness is part of the natural building blocks
I
of the
shouldn't
world.
have
You
died
know, he just
so
thinks that
much.
consciousness is. He thinks that consciousness is some sort of. So, I'm sorry. I'll start from the beginning of what I take to be part of his reasoning chain. So he starts. The
Man,
first thing I
he's
suppose to
doing
note is
so
that
good today.
a consciousness is at least potentially gradable, right? You can get more or less of it.
Seems
Both on
reasonable.
both on the kind of drifting in and out of consciousness. I went from being unconscious to conscious this morning, and from the kind of, if you were to gradually remove bits of my brain in like a horrifyingly sadistic manner, then in theory it seems
Not
intuitive
much.
that I would become less and less of a conscious being until I was dead and was no longer a conscious being.
Yeah, it seems strange if there was just like a point where everything just switches off
Yeah.
all at once.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's one kind of facet of his argument. The other is him basically saying, well, there is nothing as obvious as the existence of consciousness, which, you know, that's reasonably well. You know, I think therefore I am is you know, you might have issues with the argument, but as a whole, you know, there's very little self-evidence to consciousness. And then he basically says, well, then if the consciousness either by structure or by just matter, the preconditions for consciousness must
Really?
already be out there, and
Really?
we can kind of think about consciousness along this kind of gradation scale. And so he's sort of a panpsychist, but not in the sense that he thinks that rocks can think. Like, this is kind of
No,
but very few panpsychists actually think that. They more think,
Panpsychists don't think that rocks can.
no, exactly. As in, there's because, you know,
Well,
there's
someone somewhere does
I'm
think
sure,
that.
yeah, I'm sure someone somewhere will, but
I have
on
a
average-
podcast with Philip Goff, panpsychism. If people are interested, panpsychism, the view that sort of everything is conscious, but kind of more like, I mean, his view is more like the fundamental building blocks of the universe is consciousness, and it like
I don't
is
understand.
everywhere.
Yeah, so Strawson's position is reasonably similar to that. It's sort of saying, well, the potential for consciousness must already be there in matter.
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
I understand.
and that's sort of how he gets around
It makes sense, man. Like it makes sense to suggest that, like, yeah, there is just something about. I mean, it seems like really weird. Well, why would the fundamental like material of the universe, like, you know, be consciousness or have consciousness or provide for consciousness? Like, why would the fundamental matter of the universe like have energy and vibration and you know, velocity and mass?
I mean,
Like,
this is-
all of these properties are completely mysterious. There's no reason not to ascribe consciousness or consciousness permitting you know, fundamental properties to the
and
sort of subatomic particles.
And if you are a materialist, then you're unlikely to conceive of consciousness and in this kind of Cartesian dualist way, where it's like it's one thing. Like, you have consciousness and it is a single object. You're more likely to view it along the lines of gradation, along the lines of, well, it's composed out of something else. So, and Strawson's point is, well, if it's composed out of something else, then the preconditions must be in the thing that was there. And then, you know, and I think we are broadly more comfortable talking about gradations. This kind of comes up a little bit in integrated information theory, which is another theory of consciousness, where, you know, integrated information is everywhere. It's not just in human subjects. And I'm not suggesting that this is like necessarily a knockdown way of viewing consciousness, but I see real potential here for a philosophical framework for analysing consciousness that is non-theistic and like not even that different from materialism. Like if you think that because materialism, most of the attractive qualities of materialism just comes about from the fact that it's monist. It's just one type of stuff, and like the physicalist stroke materialist side of it is great in some ways, but there's if you could have one type of stuff that has preconditioned properties of consciousness and non-conscious properties, it doesn't strike me as like absurd that would also have loads of the philosophical strengths of materialism without this potential conscious sweetness. Of course, the reply to that is, isn't this all a bit ad hoc? Like, isn't this all like you've got a problem and you're just being like, well, there must have been consciousness before that. How explanatory is that? And I don't think I have a very good response to that.
No, but if God is being filled in here purely because of considerations of consciousness,
well, yes, then
God's sort of doing the same thing, right? And so, to the question, what is consciousness? Is this a question that atheists can't answer?
Well, I think that it's a question that, on the face of it, materialists will struggle to answer, and to the extent to which a theist doesn't have materialist constraints, then the theist could answer it, and the atheist would struggle. But I think this kind of panpsychist idea has potential, as does integrated information theory. I think that I do think that the Strawsonite,
I felt it coming when I saw this.
Or Strawsonian panpsychist theory, at the very least, does strike me as not explanatorily totally inert, because it predicts certain things, like it will predict gradations of consciousness depending on the structure, and we can, I think, broadly have a pretty good argument for gradations of consciousness based on structure. Eric Spitzgable is really keen on this at the moment. He's a professor at UCLA, and he's really hammering this point home at the moment. So I think that I don't think that this sort of modest panpsychism is as explanatorily inert as people give it credit for, as people kind of criticise it.
People who've been listening to me recently will know that, as I say, consciousness has like baffled me, especially as of late. It started with this podcast, right? Like I'm speaking to people like Anil Seth, Philip Goff, and Josh Rasmussen, and I'm just, my mind is blown, or my brain is blown, or both. I don't know, but like people know, it's kind of become a bit of a meme in many ways. I'm just like asking people like, where is the triangle in my head? Like, where is it, man? Like, show me the triangle. I saw someone made a meme of me with like a gun, being like, I'm no longer asking, where is the triangle? Because it does. It freaks me out. I lose sleep over it. There's another question that's sort of on our list, which I think functions here or fits in here. Somebody said on consciousness, this is one of your subscribers, why could my body have not accomplished all the same evolutionarily favourable tasks, simulated all the emotions and motivations, firing neurons in complex, possibly deterministic sequences of pattern response without me being there to experience it? I mean, a bit of a complicated phrasing, and maybe I'm slightly sort of going in a different direction to the question, but I'm imagining, like, why could not have things just evolved essentially as they did without first-person conscious experience? They could still be human beings interacting, like eating things and whatnot, but sort of in the way that like a flower tracks the sun. There wouldn't need to be this first-person center of consciousness.
So cute.
I mean, it does seem like a mystery. I will say that, like, if it is some evolutionary adaptation, it does seem to serve some pretty useful purposes. It does seem like it probably makes it easier for people to interact, for them to chase out food, for them to work out that they need to go and like hunt that animal and put it on the fire and all this kind of stuff, but it doesn't seem like necessary. And given how like weird it is, it does seem like a grand mystery that the universe could have evolved such that, I mean, even to get biological evolution off the ground is like a grand mystery. Like, how does life get started? Like, the universe could have just been rocks and like grass and water, but there's just this thing, this first-person conscious experience, this like potentially infinite number of imaginary triangles that can just be sort of conjured up out of nowhere and still in nowhere. It's a grand mystery. If you are a theist and you think that this is all created by a sort of immaterial mind with intention to bring about immaterial minds, then yeah, of course that's why. So I do think that like consciousness is going to be more expected on a theistic worldview than an atheistic one.
What?
Like a lot of these questions, I don't know if it's like atheists cannot answer this or cannot account for it, but I think that we have to admit in a lot of these cases that at the very least, even if an atheist can answer this question, they're going to do it with a bit more squirming
No,
than a
my
theist is going to.
why is my
I think
button
there's,
liquid
there's
again?
certainly it is.
And
Yeah,
my
it's a
finger.
difficulty for the atheist in as much as they might be able to come up with an answer, and we won't be able to come up with an answer. But like,
Crap.
it's clearly gonna be like. Well, the fact that we haven't so far shows it's probably going to be a little bit more convoluted than the theist answer, right? And yeah, I think that's a fair point, right? It's you know, what do we judge theories on if not the things they can explain and things they can predict and the things that they, you know, the observations that they make and stuff. So there is, I think, generally something there. I think that yeah, I suppose. I think one of the reasons why consciousness becomes so difficult is because we see it from both within and without. Like, I see consciousness from without with you, and I see it from within with me. And so, you know, just one response I've seen people give to this is that, consciousness probably is necessary for complex behaviour, because whenever we see complex behaviour, we see consciousness. I think, well, it's probably more accurate to say that whenever we see complex behaviour, we infer consciousness. Because we're pretty complex and we behave in certain ways, and we go, well, you know, if a bird is behaving in ways that are a bit less complicated.
Why do I always die there?
In a different way, a way that facilitates that less complex behaviour. And you know, intuitively, if you ask people whether an ant is conscious, they'll probably say yes. But they'll probably be like, well, yeah, but
too bad.
In a really minor way, you know, and that's sort of, you know, and that makes sense given the correlates of neuroscience and stuff like that. But also, I think that that response potentially also encounters difficulties when we say, well, because, you know, consciousness is necessary for complex behaviour. We say, well, I know we've only got really one example of that direct matching up, and that's with us. As in, not us as humans, as in us as individual agents.
Yeah.
And then we're kind of extrapolating that out further. So
I think AI is going to have a significant contribution to making this question too, because I mean, the sort of everybody and their dog is debating whether AI is conscious, and everybody and their AI chatbot is debating whether AI is
well,
conscious.
as you'll know.
As I well know, and look, we're not even like close to convincing me that these things are or can be conscious, but like, say in like, you know, 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, like we still have a thing which just like is not claiming to be conscious, does not appear to be conscious. It does seem that the fact that we just can't simulate it with material things, we can't simulate it with electricity and by sort of replacing the biological matter with digital matter or you know, cables instead of neurons or whatever. It does maybe seem to give us a clue that consciousness is something more than material. And likewise, obviously, if the reverse is true and we just develop a you know, convincingly conscious agent out of computer materials, I think that the materialists would have much more of a leg to stand on in saying that we're just material beings as well. You know?
Also, yeah, there's a question about what makes something convincingly conscious.
Yeah.
Because the problem we have about talking about AI consciousness is not that different from the problem we have talking about other human consciousness or animal consciousness.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're still doing the behaviour to whatever is hidden from the behaviour inference.
Yeah. Well, famously, there's the Turing test.
Yes.
The Turing test is a test that you can put a computer through as to whether you can tell that it's a computer or not. And so if it passes the test, then you can't tell that it's not a real person on the other side. Right? That's how a computer can pass the Turing test. And somebody recently on my ChatGPT video where I tried to convince it that it's conscious, and ChatGPT is like, "I'm not conscious, Alex. I'm not conscious." And I was like, "You're having me on." They said something that I thought was kind of eerie. They said, like, you know, everybody's wondering about whether a computer can pass the Turing test, but are we ready for one which fails it on purpose?
My controversial take on AI is that we, at the very least, we ought to have a theory of when we're going to consider it conscious, if we're going to consider it conscious.
Yeah, sure.
Because, partly because of, you know, the whole AI worry, but also, like, and this point was made again by Schwitzgebel recently, was that, like, they'll need rights and protections, right? Like, if we're going to create life, we can't just abandon it. So if we decide that that's possible, and we decide that there's going to be a point at which we consider it conscious, whatever that's going to be, then we need to do some hard thinking about when that's going to be, in order to not create, like, I don't know, what could be an enormous civil rights disaster.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two sort of competing fears here. There's fear of like evil robot aliens trying to kill us all, and like really good, happy, personable robot aliens who need rights and protection because we're the cruel aliens who are sort of abusing them and enslaving them. But like, there is some kind of like interesting sci-fi concept here of, but when you think of the robot takeover movies, it's always these big robots coming in and destroying everyone with their big guns, but something like a tyrannical AI robot that is so successfully tyrannical because it's convinced people that it is not that. That's why I find that
Brave New World.
That's why I found that. That's why I find that comment so eerie. It's sort of like, what if it's like purposefully trying not to pass the Turing test? What is purposely trying to convince us that it's not conscious? It's just a little bit sort of kind of scary to think about. But
yeah, well, I hope that maybe it would be best if the theists or the anti-materialists are right.
Yeah,
and we can't do consciousness with bare materials. That'd be.
Well, I've always just thought that the question of what consciousness is and the question of whether it's material is the answer to the question of, for instance, the simulation hypothesis. Everybody just assumes that we can simulate things into this sort of infinite regress of simulations, but it only works if it's possible to be in a simulation where we have consciousness simulated. And so, like, if it turns out that consciousness is more than material, it's not something that we can create with an AI or something, then like the simulation hypothesis for me just completely collapses. So this question of consciousness and whether it's material or not, I think has some interesting implications for things like AI, but also for these fun little tidbits like the simulation hypothesis.
Well,
that lives or dies on your theory of consciousness, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, theories of consciousness are probably one of the greatest examples of
Well,
a philosophical question that is truly practical
based.
in like a really visceral, everyday sense.
Yes.
Like our theory, whether we decide that consciousness can be simulated or not, could change the course of history.
Yeah. Finally,
Okay.
one more question,
Yeah.
and then we're done, because God knows how long we've been. How long have we been going now?
2 hours 35.
It's been a long time.
I bet you'll see like my answers degrade in quality as time goes on.
We'll see if people agree with that. It's been a long time, but it's a good time, I think. We need to
Come on.
get this mentioned. Fine-tuning. Somebody says, fine-tuning never heard a good rebuttal to the issue. Christopher Hitchens was in the back of a car once, I think with like Doug Wilson or someone, and he was asked, are there any good religious arguments? And he says, the fine-tuning, the sort of hair's breadth balance, it does sort of...
At some point, certainly, we were all asked, well, which is the best argument you've yet come against on the other side? And I think every one of us picks the fine-tuning one. That's the most intriguing.
The Goldilocks,
Fine-tuning to 1 degree, one hair difference is nothing. But even though it doesn't prove a designer could all have happened without it, you have to spend time thinking about it and working on it. It's not a trivial. We all say that.
And he sort of said it was something that really did actually trouble him. And a lot of atheists, possibly influenced by that book, I don't know, seem to say that the most powerful religious argument is the fine-tuning argument.
It's
And
laughable.
so, what's the question that
It's
atheists can't
not.
answer? Why are the constants of the universe so finely tuned? There are constants which govern the physical universe, things like the strength of gravity, the strong and weak nuclear force, this kind of stuff. Like, if these had different values, by whatever it is, 1 part in 1 times 10 to the minus billion or whatever, the universe couldn't exist. It's just like balance on a knife edge. If gravity was slightly stronger,
Very
then the universe
cute.
would have collapsed in on itself. If it was slightly weaker, then everything would have flown apart so fast that even atoms couldn't form. So there are 3 options here. The constants of the universe are so finely tuned because of chance, because of necessity, or because of design. Chance seems ludicrous because the odds are just so unfathomably small. Necessity seems maybe possible, but like there doesn't seem to be any like logical reason why something would like the strength of gravity would have to be what it is, and the only thing left there is
Yeah, they're
design,
so
which requires something like God. So, by ruling out design as an atheist, how do you answer this question?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'd say that I share the intuition that this is forming. Like, and it quite often gives me pause for thought. This is. I think that the primary way that I think we could respond to this is to again draw
Sake
on
of fucking God.
the justification of the notion of possibility when stressed so this is kind of broadly an argument from analogy, right? It's like Paley's watch, but with the entire universe. The universe is so finely tuned. If it was off by a fraction of a tiny number, then everything would collapse and we'd all be doomed. And if we were to find a similarly intricate object in the world,
Tell Schopenhauer about how well the universe is fucking tuned.
we would say, well, of course that was designed. And again, it's interesting. To bring this full circle from the beginning of the podcast, this is very similar to a point that Hume touches upon, where he again just questions the justification that we have for saying things could have been different, because it's like, well, what do we mean could there? As in, sure, it's non-contradictory to say things could have been different, but like, what do we genuinely mean? Like, it seems like we need a meatier sense of could than that. And also, he throws together, like, almost like off the top of his head, like a load of other hypotheses, because they're kind of equally, so he says, it could be that God is not intelligent, but just really prolific. So just if you do something an infinite number of times, then you'll eventually have it. Which is kind of which is basically chance, but saying, well,
Yes, some people do take the chance.
Yes,
route, and they just say that we live in a multiverse. Which I've spoken to people who believe in the multiverse. Not the kind of multiverse that I think would actually work here, but there are people who just say, yeah, there's a multiverse. We have no. Seems like we couldn't even possibly have evidence to sort of indicate that's the case, but it does explain it. Okay, there's one hypothesis.
And the other one he says is that we don't really know what he's talking about order generally. He says we don't really know how ordered or disordered universes could be.
Yes.
Is one that kind of skepticism about the notion of possibility.
And that's more taking the necessity line.
Yes, exactly.
To say, had the law of gravity been different by one part in whatever it is, the universe couldn't exist, is not the same thing as saying there's a 1 in, like a 1 part in 10 to the whatever chance that it does exist, because the sort of the room to maneuver in terms of what would have been different had it been different is not the same thing as the chance that it could have been different.
Yes, exactly. So basically the problem there is, well, how do you define a probability space on the ways the universe could have been, because we don't have any sort of observations there. And Hume's point is not necessarily that that either of these are so the dialogue kind of runs where Philo, the character in Hume's dialogue, said this, and then the response that he gets is, but like, isn't the idea of an intelligent God just so much more plausible? And then his response is to say something like, well, our idea of what is plausible is solely intra-universal. It doesn't step outside the universe, it's just formed within it. Outside the universe, he's like, well, it's not necessarily that all bets are necessarily off, but that we don't know what bets are on, is his point. So it's more of an agnostic point than an atheist point. He says, he doesn't know the answer. We are ill-equipped to know the answer. But
Why can I never improve?
like, I don't know. It just doesn't it. On the other hand, doesn't it just seem like the universe definitely could have been tuned differently? It definitely isn't.
Hot.
Maybe, but there is a question that's sometimes asked as to if this is by design. Like God designs everything, including presumably the parameters by which universes can and can't exist. And so there is this mystery of like, well, why would it be so difficult? Like, if the universe is what everything exists for, like the universe exists for the creation of humankind, that's like the purpose of it all, then why would the parameters be set such that they're balanced on such a knife edge? Why wouldn't it be why wouldn't it be that like the sort of meta laws of the universe were such that it could exist in all kinds of different conditions? Now, I've never found that a very convincing response, but I must say that I spoke recently to my friend Phil Halper, who I've mentioned on this show before. He's got some wonderful ideas, and we were talking about Gnosticism, the tradition in Christianity. And I've been banging on about Gnosticism, and everybody seems to hate me for it online at the moment. At least the Christian community are taking umbrage with how much I mention it. But like, in some Gnostic traditions, there's this idea that the material world is created by this like evil demiurge, that the true God is this immaterial spiritual being, and that the material world is created by an evil or malevolent sort of figure. And so the Christian Gnostic position is many times that Jesus is sent by the Father to enter the material world and sort of help people to throw off their material conditions and, you know, regain sort of their spiritual truth, whatever. And Phil pointed out
Why am I dying
that the
to-
fine-tuning argument
am I
seems to
clicking
work better
this,
for a
or
Gnostic
what am I
cosmology
doing?
than a sort of traditional monotheistic one, because you've got these meta conditions which seem to have been designed such that it's like near on
Fire.
impossible to create a material universe,
I'm not
because
sure.
the true God, the true sort of creator of
are those
everything,
fucking
didn't want
arts?
it to happen. Because the material world is evil and bad and incompetent and all this kind of stuff, and so the true God sort of sets the parameters so that it's nearly impossible. Like it's as impossible as it can be for a material world to come into existence, but the evil demiurge balances everything just right to bring it into existence.
Yeah,
I thought
that's-
that was quite a novel point.
Yeah, I know, but that's fantastic. I hadn't thought of that. I'd be surprised if anyone had thought of that.
Yeah.
That's smart.
I can't remember where he got it from. I wish he probably got it from somewhere. I wish I could credit it, but it was a really interesting thought. Which, I mean, it's a bit silly. I'm being a bit silly here, but it does point out that, like, it kind of just depends where your intuition's like. I mean, why is everything balanced on a knife edge? That question can be asked in both directions. The theist can say, you know, if atheism is true, then why is everything just balanced on a knife edge? And I could say, if like theism is true, why is everything balanced on a knife edge?
yeah.
You know,
The,
it's the same question.
Yeah, I mean, there's again, it trades on this idea of like, well,
Why am
once
I
you're at
dying
once you're at
to
the
this? I will never
level
understand.
of meta laws, how likely is it that the laws of the universe were a certain way?
Yeah.
We're just so outside the realm of anything that we normally reason about that I find it hard to come to any conclusion whatsoever, apart from
No, I will
just
never
throwing my
practice.
intuition at it and kind of grasping at something, and it's like, oh yeah, it kind of seems like it would be unlikely.
Yeah.
But when I think about all of the other times that I infer something is unlikely, I'm taking a set of previous experiences or other people's previous experiences or what I know about the laws that govern this universe and coming up with a hypothesis about how likely it is that a given set of possibilities will emerge.
Yeah.
But I don't have any of the prior data once I step outside to the meta laws of the universe.
It seems to me like if the fine-tuning argument is correct, that it is exceedingly unlikely for the constants of the universe to be as they are and that they needed to be in order to create the universe. That either God really didn't want the universe to exist. Like he created things so that like he really did not want this to happen. And maybe somewhere in the sort of infinite realm in which he exists, it just had to happen at some point. Or he really did want it to happen because he balanced these laws so perfectly, but he's somehow constrained by these, like, imagine like the immaterial creator God before the existence of the universe is constrained by the strength of gravity and the strong nuclear force. What can that even like mean? How can God be constrained by the strength of the strong and weak nuclear forces in creating the universe? That just sort of seems unthinkable to
Do you
me.
even
Well, I
have
think
to
this is
press?
draws upon a wider point we've touched upon a number of times, which is that there's an open question about if God does a lot of grounding for theistic philosophy, and quite right too. Right, this is like you know, right back to like Aquinas and long before then. God does a lot of grounding, and it's a good philosophical job if you can get it. So it makes sense why he would. But then the meta question of what
Did I press this one?
what grounds the things that seem to constrain God is like things like the laws of logic, which classically constrain God. It's like, well, God can't ground something that seems metaphysically prior to him and is constraining what he can do. So yeah, and the meta laws of the universe is another one. It's like, well, if God made the meta laws of the universe, then in what sense does if God is constrained by the meta laws of the universe and had to do this fine-tuning thing, then it seems like what's grounding those meta laws?
Yeah,
You know,
so he's either constrained by these meta laws, which is like really weird.
Yeah,
It means God
yeah,
is
yeah.
constrained by things like the force of gravity or the strength of gravity. And if he's not constrained by them, then it seems really weird that he designed things so that they seem so constrained.
Yes, and I mean this comes up with lots of other things like you know, the laws of morality. I mean, classically, this comes up in its like really nascent form in the Euthyphro dilemma, but has been developed a lot since then. Which is that if God is the thing that grounds the laws of morality, then from God's perspective, the laws of morality are morally arbitrary, which is amazing, right? That's you know, that then there is just a kind of, well, he must have some other reason. You know,
Forgot.
don't know what it is, but you know, there is this what God grounds can't ground God, and what God is constrained by he can't ground. And sometimes it's very helpful for him to be constrained by things, and sometimes it's very helpful for him to ground things. But each of those has philosophical trade-offs, because once they're in one position, it seems very unintuitive that it would be in the other position.
So, yet
This is
another
way
question
more
which gives us
consistent.
pause is difficult. I can't say that we've solved the problem. And like you say, it gives you a lot of trouble. I mean, I wouldn't say it's like easy. It's just not my favourite argument. I mean, a lot of people say this is like their best religious argument is the one that they struggle with the most. I mean, I find something like the existence of consciousness more compelling for theism than something like fine-tuning. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe I just haven't thought about it.
I think for me the most troubling one we've looked at today is the self-undermining one.
Yeah.
That's the one that genuinely does keep.
Yeah, like the argument from reason.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
That's like that.
I certainly find that the most interesting, and maybe also actually the most like difficult to respond to. Maybe not quite as like just moving as the consciousness that I am like constantly
Yeah.
like in and aware of. Although you're not always aware of your consciousness. Even though you are conscious all the time you're awake, you're not always aware of it. I think
It's kind of transparent quite a lot.
Josh Rasmussen said he talked something about the difference between noticing a tree and noticing that you've noticed a tree.
Yeah, I mean,
And it's sort of the second one that you need to really be thinking about consciousness as opposed to just being conscious. I can't remember sort of the exact phrase he used, but it was something like that. At any rate, these are all questions which, I can't say like we've answered them, but to say that they're questions that atheists can't answer, I know it's a good clickbaity video title, but I hope people have found some interest in listening to us give it an attempt and found us to be relatively fair on our treatment. I mean, I think a lot of this can be summed up in a question or a response that I got on Twitter that somebody said when I put out a tweet asking for questions. What's the question that atheists can't answer? Somebody said, most questions. That's what makes us different to everyone else.
okay, yeah.
Admitting that like,
Yeah,
we
we don't.
can't answer questions, but it's the fact that we admit that we don't know that makes us atheists. I don't know if that's a bit too self-congratulatory to say or to end on maybe, but like I wouldn't just describe that to atheists, but I do think that this sort of basic response that seems underneath almost all of our responses here that clarify we don't know. I don't know the answer. I don't know what consciousness is. I don't know how to justify reason, but it's not clear to me that theism necessarily helps, and it's not clear to me that the certainty that theism sort of gives people is legitimate. The best that I can say is that I don't know the answer to a lot of these questions, but I certainly would be a far cry from saying that it's impossible for atheists to one day answer them at least.
Yes, I think that another thing, a kind of general takeaway from this discussion is that almost any ambitious
Right.
philosophical view will have trade-offs to it. It is almost any philosophical view has questions that it cannot answer, and I think that that's very, very interesting. It's one of the things that allows philosophy to continue. Is hopefully one day we'll converge upon a perfect, total philosophy.
And I think it'd be interesting to maybe sit down with a theist and do a series of questions that theists can't answer. Why does the mind map onto the brain so perfectly if it's not just the same thing as the brain? Why is there suffering in the world if God is good? The Euthyphro dilemma, these kinds of things. Like there are perennial questions that people have been raising for thousands of years to theists in the same way they've been doing to atheists. And I'm kind of glad in a way that no one really has an answer, because not only would I be out of a job, but also out of a hobby.
Yes, that's what I.
Well, Joe, thanks for what might be the longest episode. Have we gone over the 3-hour mark? Sam Harris might have still... I think Sam Harris still just about takes your biscuit, but it's been fun nonetheless, and I hope people, especially if they're still listening,
The
you know,
episode with Sam Harris
good
was so
on you.
good.
I'd say like
You're in for the long haul.
I'd say like, if you're watching this, then don't forget to subscribe. But if you've made it this far and you're not a subscriber to the channel, then
Okay,
I've already
this-
taken far too much from you. So do as you please. But Joe, honestly, thanks for taking so much time, especially to sit down and answer some of these questions.
Thank you so much for having me.
To watch my last episode with Joe, click the link that's on your screen. If you want to support my work and get early ad-free access to episodes, then go to alexoconnor.com and subscribe to my Substack. Thanks for watching this extraordinarily long episode of Within Reason, and I'll see you in the next one.
It's lawless cool. it
大したことないですよ。
twice in
Shut up.
Adams. I still spent a lot. Last one. So. Nine.
Shut up.
This Now my hand is heavy and trembling and weak and all that. Alright. Doesn't matter. Goodbye.